Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If, with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku was teleported to Teyvat. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Hitoshi Shinso is out of bounds. The winner, Izuku Midoriya. Izuku panted as he looked around the stadium. There must have been at least hundreds, if not thousands, of people who were cheering his name. Izuku, however, paid them no heed. He scanned the audience looking for a familiar face, and he grinned when he saw it. The man Izuku was looking for was an unnaturally thin man who appeared to be in his early to mid-40s. His eyes were a strange color, his sclera being completely black, while his eyes were a shade of blue. He wore a bright yellow suit with a bland blue tie. The man grinned an unnaturally wide smile at the green-haired boy and gave him a thumbs up. This man was Toshinori Yagi. Hero name, All Might. All Might, for whoever lived under a rock, was the #1 hero in Japan. He had many names and titles, his most famous one being the symbol of peace. However, he was also Izuku's mentor. His quirk, One for All. An incredible quirk that was used to save thousands, if not millions, of lives. However, All Might was growing weaker thanks to a villain he had fought in the past. He was limited to 3 hours a day of hero work, so he had passed the awesome quirk onto Izuku after witnessing the boy, who was quirkless at the time, jump at a villain to save the life of a fellow student named Bakugo. The most impressive thing, besides the amount of bravery Izuku displayed, was the fact that he was willing to save the life of Bakugo, who had tormented him since they were children for not having any quirk. Even to this day, Bakugo still bullies Izuku and Izuku is still terrified of Bakugo. That being said, they are currently on somewhat better, if you can even call it that term, since Izuku beat Bakugo in battle training. Izuku gave a huge smile to the symbol of peace as he tried his best to ignore the pain in his fingers. The match against Shinso had not been easily won, considering Shinso's quirk was very deadly. Shinso's quirk, Brainwash, almost cost Izuku the match, considering all Shinso had to do was give him a command to walk out of the ring. Right before he could walk out, however, he saw multiple people staring at him, and he had snapped put of it. However, he had broken his fingers after charging One for All through them to stop himself from walking. He had then used a move from Bakugo's arsenal, and threw Shinso over his shoulder and out of the ring. The boy in the ring, Izuku Midoriya, was a boy who had troubled past. He was born quirkless, which meant that he had no power to call his own. Back in his old school, he was the target of teasing because of his nervous attitude and hero notebooks. Even kids with stupid quirks, like stretching their eyeballs or changing their ear size, made fun of Izuku. Izuku, however, just accepted this and dealt with it throughout his entire life. However, he was recently given All Might's quirk, One for All, because of his heroic actions. The only problem was that Izuku broke himself when he used his quirk. His quirk could easily kill if he unleashed a punch at someone, but his arm would break if he did so. So, he had to fight quirkless half the time since he couldn't use his quirk unless it was an emergency. However, he was unknowingly inspiring quirkless kids around the world, showing them how, even without a quirk, they could still become heroes. Izuku even came in first for the obstacle course without using a quirk. However, despite now having thousands of fans, both quirkless and quirked, he was still an extremely shy, nervous boy. In the cheering crowd, there sat a blonde-haired, spiky-headed teen who was growling at Izuku. This was Bakugo. Bakugo's quirk, Explosion, was a very powerful quirk. Everyone in his old school complimented his quirk and made fun of Izuku for not having one. Bakugo was the source of the teasing, and sometimes went from teasing to threats, and one time, even told the green-haired boy to kill himself. Bakugo had regretted the suicidal words the moment they had left his mouth. Not that he would ever tell anyone that. He also got you with that shoulder toss, right Bakugo? Denki Kaminari, another one of their classmates from Class 1A, had asked with a teasing nature. Shut up, dunce face. Bakugo snarled as Denki mocked being hurt from his words. That jerk, Bakugo hissed under his breath. He was totally baiting him, damn Deku. Izuku and Shinso met up for a round of applause. Shinso was looking disappointed and frustrated as Izuku just looked physically and mentally exhausted. Well, announced the pro hero Midnight, put your hands together for our fierce competitors. As the crowd cheered, yelled, and clapped, Izuku looked up and Shinso. Hey Shinso, Izuku called out to the tired boy. Why do you want to be a hero? Shinso looked up before turning away from the green-haired boy. We don't get to choose the things we naturally admire. Shinso responded rather coldly. As Shinso walked away, he suddenly heard voices. Hey Shinso. Good job, man. Shinso looked up, his anger and frustration quickly melting into awe as he saw his fellow general studies students cheering for him. You had us on the edge of our seats. You did just as well as the guy who got third in the obstacle course. You're the shining star of us general studies guys. Shinso looked at them in amazement as they cheered him on. The business course had heard and seen this and started muttering amongst themselves. The hell's you thinking? Putting him in general studies. Yeah, he's got potential to be a hero. Both you and that green-haired kid did great. Keep it up. Shinso looked down at his feet and did something that no one, not even himself, remembered doing. He smiled. Not a huge smile, but a tiny smile did grace his features. He turned to Izuku. The smile not having left his face, Izuku stared at him, dumbstruck and slightly in awe and happiness. Shinso then began to talk. Maybe I failed this time, but I'm not giving up. He grinned at Izuku as the green-haired boy stared at him impassively. I'm still going to be the #1 hero, don't you agree? Izuku smiled and felt his head nod. He came back to his senses, realizing that he had quickly fell under Shinso's quirk again, and frowned at his smirking opponent. Izuku, do me a favor and don't get eliminated so easily. Not at all would be better too. Izuku's face went from a frown to a look of determination before nodding, this time of his own accord. Shinso grinned before walking out of the stadium. Izuku watched him walk out and quickly snapped back into reality. The green-haired boy smiled and walked out of the arena too. Izuku had been greeted by his friends when he had emerged from the room he had been recovering in. They all clapped as his friend, Ilda Tenya, patted him on the back. They all bombarded him with questions, like how it felt to be brainwashed, how he broke out, what happened to his fingers, and other actions of the category. Izuku, who was a nervous person in general, became much worse when his potential crush, Uraraka Ochako, had walked over, got in his face, and started to ask questions excitedly. Uraraka's quirk, zero gravity, allowed her to take away weight from an object which allows it to float. However, the more weight that she lifts into the air, the more sick she gets. She was also completely unaware of Izuku's feelings towards her. Unfortunately for our green-haired protagonist, the cute girl never noticed his face reddening the longer they talked, until he finally excused himself to go to the bathroom. That's strange. Uraraka frowned as she watched Izuku, whom she called Deku as a sign of, you can do it, stumble away from the group as he walked right into a wall before blushing, even more in sheer embarrassment and going around the corner. Do you think something's wrong with Deku? He's acting a bit strange. Maybe he lost too much blood in the fight. I doubt it, said Tenya, whose quirk was engine. He looked like he had a stomachache of some sort. Well, I think he's acting how he always acts, Kiro, said Tsuyu Isui. Everyone had accepted her strange tic of saying the words Kiro. It made sense concerning her quirk was frog, so she obviously had some frog-like tendencies. MHM. Came a smug Minru Mainta's voice, whose quirk was pop-off, and was also a huge pervert. Uraraka looked confused. What's that supposed to mean, Mainta? Mainta held back a grin. Everyone in their year knew that the cute girl liked the broccoli hair-colored boy and vice versa. The fact they both tried to hide it and blatantly ignore it, which Mainta just found hilarious. But he wasn't going to tell them. Not yet anyway. Mainta only shrugged before putting on a relaxed persona. Nothing. Nothing at all. Uraraka then looked at him and glared. Were you picturing something inappropriate again, Mainta? That is so you. Ilda shook his head. You never change, do you? Tusu then looked at the others. Come on, guys. We're going to miss lunch, Kiro. Mainta stared at them as they walked away, shocked by his discovery. Do they not know? Thought Mainta. How in the hell do they not know? It's the most obvious thing in the world. He sighed before following suit and walked through. I'll let them think I was thinking of something inappropriate. Midoriya, when you get older you better pay me back for this. Little did the purple-haired midget realize that Midoriya was nearby. But he wouldn't be for long. Izuku yawned as he walked through a tunnel within the stadium, after quickly getting away from what could have been an embarrassing situation. He was sure Mainta had figured out that he liked Ochako, but he was not sure if the others knew or not. He quickly walked faster as some of the blood rushed to his face. He was walking so quickly that he nearly ran into a man who was walking towards him. Izuku shrieked in surprise as he ran into the man, as what appeared to be snow globes fell from the man's pockets. The man cursed and looked at the green-haired boy with a hint of annoyance. "You, boy," announced the man in an overdramatic fashion as he pointed at Izuku with his hands in a rather flamboyant manner. Izuku looked at the man in terror. I'm so sorry, sir," Izuku pleaded. Here. Allow me to help why you with that." The man glared at him for a moment longer and sighed in resignation. "No, forgive me. I overreacted and scared you a little. I should be the one apologizing," he said while bowing. "Although, it appears we created quite a mess. Could you help me out, good sir?" Izuku nodded and helped him pick up the snow globe-like objects. Izuku gazed at them in wonder. Pardon me, sir," Izuku said as he held one up and analyzed it. "But what are these things?" The man smiled at Izuku. "Those, my boy, are realms." Izuku blinked in confusion. "Our realms?" The man laughed at Izuku's ignorance. "Don't worry, my boy, I'll explain it. My quirk, Globe World, allows me to create worlds that are fake, such as a world where there are not any quirks, or a world you may see in a manga, book, or show. For example." He broke open a globe, revealing a world where there were no quirks. They looked down and saw hundreds of people walking around a city. There was much talking, screaming, yelling, and laughing heard as they saw the people interact with each other. "As you see," he said, closing the portal and trying hard to suppress the pride he felt at the awestruck look the boy was giving him. "There are many worlds and realms I can create and observe." "That's incredible," Izuku exclaimed, trying his hardest not to mutter about how useful such a quirk could be. He jumped in excitement. Can I see another one, sir?" The man laughed. "Sure, boy. Just make sure you're not lat." A loud cracking noise interrupted them. Izuku looked around in confusion before immediately vanishing. The man looked on in horror as he stared where Izuku had landed from his excited jumping. A broken globe where Izuku's shoe had landed. Oh no," the man said, looking terrified. He always looked into the world to observe, but he never went into a world. The man turned pale as he heard voices coming his way, as one though raced through his mind. Where did the boy go? Izuku's eyes opened slowly, and he only saw darkness. He looked around in confusion. Did someone shut the lights off in the hallway he was in? Where was the man? Huh? Who turned the lights off? This doesn't look like the hallway I was in. He immediately jumped up and smashed his head on a rocky ceiling with a loud thump. He gave a quick yelp while rubbing his head and looking around himself in confusion. Where did that man go? Where am I? This isn't the stadium. Was I kidnapped? More questions ran through Izuku's head as he looked around for the first time. It appeared he was in a dark, gloomy cave with barely any light. Izuku suddenly remembered where he had been the moments before he had gone unconscious. That man, Izuku thought as he began to panic even more due to the unfamiliar environment. Did he do this? I wonder if it was on purpose or not. Was he a villain? Izuku pondered. Well, he thought as he sighed and propped himself up. Worrying about it won't get me anywhere. I need to find some people and ask them. As he made his way out of the depressing cave, worry suddenly overcame him. Uraraka, Ilda, Mainta, Asui, Kaken. He thought as his face took on a terrified expression. Were they hurt? Were they kidnapped too? Izuku looked terrified, and the thought of his friends being hurt. After all, they were close to him after the event, so maybe they were alone too. He suddenly stopped and took a few deep breaths. Okay, Izuku. He thought to himself, calming himself down with a deep breath. For one, I don't even know if they're here with me. I didn't see them anywhere near that man. Besides, he thought as his shoulders began to loosen and become less tense. By any chance, if they are here, they have their quirks with them. They'll know how to take care of themselves. Izuku finally looked a bit more content as he slowly made his way over to an enormous object in the dark cave. It appeared to be a boulder. Izuku grunted as he pushed at the boulder, but the boulder did not meet his needs. It barely moved as Izuku sighed and aimed his finger at the boulder. I need to know where I am, but this is going to hurt for sure. He took a deep breath, both physically and mentally preparing himself for the upcoming pain. He then let out a shout. Delaware smash. The force of the attack blew apart the boulder into multiple pieces as rocks flew in every direction. Izuku covered his eyes as dust flew everywhere, only to open them to sunlight protruding through the opening in the cave which he had just made. He groaned as he felt his finger throb. Ignoring the pain to the best of his ability, he climbed his way over what was left of the rocks as walked out of the cave, the ground beneath him turning from rocks to soft grass. He walked into the bright light and saw a beautiful landscape before him. The trees and grass, they were healthy as their leaves and blades swayed in the breeze. The waters were pure and untouched by pollution. And the mountains that he saw in the distance looked as though they touched the sky. Izuku looked over to his right and saw an enormous village. The word city might have been a better choice of words. The buildings there were huge and luxurious. An enormous windmill sat in the town, along with many other buildings near and surrounding it. There were strong stone walls around the city to stop intruders, and a building that was so big Izuku could clearly see all of its details, even for being so far away. Izuku blinked in amazement. He suddenly remembered the man's quirk. Globe world. The man had been correct. Izuku was indeed in another world. But if I am in another world, where's the man? He pondered as he made his way over to a tree. He quickly ripped a huge branch off and took off his left shoelace. Guess I'll have to survive for now. It shouldn't be too long until someone finds me, right? He thought as he began to make a fishing rod. Now, had anyone from Izuku's world had seen Izuku making a fishing rod, they would have been amazed. Izuku, the superhero nerd, knows how to make tools to survive. Had his classmates from his old school heard this, they would have been on the floor from laughing so hard. But it was true. Izuku did know how to survive when put into a situation when all odds were against him. Most of the skills were from hanging out with Kachin. When they were children, Kachin and his friends' followers went down to the creek to catch fish once a month. Since Izuku never got a fishing rod, even though everyone else did, he had to make his own. He wasn't perfect at first, but he got better as time went on. He eventually became a very good toolmaker thanks to Kachin's ignorance and arrogance. All right? He thought to himself as he examined the pole. This'll do for now. Next up, I'll have to make a shelter and fire. Izuku then walked over to the river and looked at himself in the reflection of the water. He was still wearing the UA training uniform, but his finger to his sudden realization had miraculously healed. He flexed it amazed, wondering if the man's quirk had fixed his finger. Izuku then turned towards the nearby forest and stared at it for a minute. He analyzed it, taking in every detail, seeing if it would make a good place to call home. Let's see, he thought. There are lots of trees for wood, so I don't have to worry about shelter or fire. I hear lots of animals, so that settles my food problem. And there's a river right here, so that solves my water problem. Izuku turned towards the forest and sighed. He wanted to go and explore the giant town he had seen earlier, but told himself no. Not only did he have to survive on his own, he didn't know if he could trust anyone in this world yet. As he muttered to himself on what should be done, a snarling noise suddenly came from behind him. He turned around, seeing a giant bear getting into an attack position. Izuku stared at it blankly for a moment, his fishing rod shaking slightly, when something strange happened. The bear looked up at Izuku, and fear immediately filled its eyes. It stared for a moment longer, before running away into the trees and out of sight. Izuku blinked before realizing what had happened. He stared off into the trees, but the bear was not one of his problems. That's odd. He thought to himself, I wasn't that scared of the bear. Most people, even with quirks, would run away. But I didn't, and the bear ran away instead. I know that I look exactly the same because I saw my reflection in the water. What's going on? Izuku's thoughts were interrupted by his growling stomach. He sighed before walking over to the river with his fishing rod. It was going to be a long day. Izuku whistled as he cast his fishing rod into the water with his uninjured hand. He leaned back a little and looked up at the puffy clouds. It had been a number of days since he had gotten here, and there was still no sign that he would return home. During the couple days, Izuku had been working himself to the bone. He had made himself a little wooden shelter and had managed to get some fruits and smaller animals to eat. While it was true that Izuku could use one for all to take them down, he didn't want to take the whole forest down as well. He still couldn't control one for all, and he knew that if he wanted to survive, he would have to learn how to control it quickly. Another thing that Izuku had not done was that he had not gone into the town yet. Izuku had seen night patrols come from the town during that last few days, and feared what they would do if he was found. He didn't own the forest. If they did, by any chance, then he would be arrested. Izuku didn't like that at all, but the forest was comfortable, and he did get food and shelter here. But Izuku knew that he couldn't survive like this forever. He just had to wait. To wait for someone, like All Might, to come and help him. So far, however, there was zero progress on the matter of being rescued. Izuku knew that he had to try escaping eventually. But for now, it was a no-go. Izuku's thoughts were interrupted when he suddenly jumped when bubbles appeared in the water. He glanced at it, and then back at his pole. He grinned a little at the thought of catching a devious fish. All right, Izuku thought as he gave the pole a little tug. I don't have much bait on me, but I guess I'll give it a shot. But odds are I won't catch. Izuku's thoughts were interrupted when he felt a big weight get added to his pole. It almost took him and the pole into the rushing current. He quickly put his foot onto a rock for support. This thing is huge, Izuku exclaimed aloud before pulling the rod harder, which it seemed to fight. Finally, he gave one last tug with all of his might. A figure suddenly broke the water's surface. Izuku gaped in surprise. What he thought had been a fish was, in reality, a little girl with snow-white hair. She had appeared to be a halo over her head, along with a white jumper with so many fancy patterns on it. Izuku questioned if this girl was royalty. She also had a cape on her back, to top off her eccentric appearance. Izuku blinked in surprise as the girl groaned from the end of his line and got dragged back into the water due to her weight. Izuku started to panic as he began to pull on the fishing rod. She didn't come up, to his terror. No, Izuku shouted, standing up. He knew he had to save this girl. He was not going to let anyone die on his watch. Here we go, Izuku yelled before charging one for all through his arm with the fishing rod in it. He took a deep breath and then yelled, Detroit, pull. He pulled his arm up, feeling his arm splinter and break, and he bit his tongue to stop himself from screaming in pain. The girl not only broke the surface of the water, but came out so fast she created a sonic boom from the pull. Izuku looked up in horror as she fell from the sky towards the ground. Damn it! The boy swore in his head as the green-haired boy, in response to this sudden event, began charging one for all into his legs. He knew that it would break him, but he didn't care. All he cared about was saving this girl. What happened to him could wait. Manhattan leap. And leap he did. Izuku jumped so high that anyone watching would think he could fly. Izuku grit his teeth front he pain as he caught the girl in his good arm and fell to the ground with her. Sir. A knight had ran into the well-decorated room gasping for breath. Everyone in the town had heard a sonic boom. Immediately after that, there had been another sonic boom that followed, as well as a hole appearing in some clouds. Izuku had broken clouds apart with his tug and leap. He had unknowingly sent the town into a frenzy. People were panicking in the streets, kids crying for their moms and dads. The city of Mondstadt believed that they were under attack. Sir, the knight began. We saw another one. Another random boom. Do you think the gods are trying to get a message across? The man he was talking to was a fairly tall man. He had dark blue hair that went down in a ponytail. He wore a fur coat over his right shoulder. He wore a combination of blue and black clothes, and had an air of seriousness about him. His most defining feature, besides his blue hair, was his eye patch that he wore. He turned around and started the knight right in the eye, making said knight shake slightly. The gods? The blue-haired man questioned, more to himself than to the knight standing in front of him. He looked up at the ceiling of the room. I doubt it. There is a slight possibility that it could be the gods, but we have not done anything to anger them. Sir, the knight said, regaining some composure. What do you think we should do? Should we send a unit out there to inspect the site? The blue-haired man sighed and looked at the window, his hands folded behind his back. The city was not doing too well. The nobles of the town were sucking the town dry. It would take a miracle in order to get the city back to its former glory. He still prayed to the gods that they would send anyone, to help them. So far, the only thing they got were less resources. The man sighed before addressing the knight once more. Send Amber. She is more than capable of taking any hostile forces that could have caused that boom. Izuku felt all the air leave him as he hit the ground. He wheezed in pain as he took in deep breaths. It took him a minute to realize how stupid that was. He could have just jumped in and saved the girl instead of having to yank her up. He cursed himself under his breath, telling himself he deserved the pain for putting an innocent life in danger. Izuku was so deep in his thoughts, he had not noticed how the girl had woken up and was looking at him in complete awe and admiration. Wow! The girl squealed as she gazed at Izuku in awe and respect. She was amazed at the amount of power Izuku has displayed in order to save her. He had risked everything in order to help her. Izuku still hadn't noticed that she was conscious and was still cursing under his breath. That was so cool, she exclaimed. Izuku then snapped out of his thoughts and looked at the snow-colored haired girl. Her eyes shone with excitement and amazement. You saved Paimon. The girl, whose name was apparently Paimon, squeaked. How can Paimon ever thank you? Izuku became flustered at the attention he was receiving from the small girl. She's adorable, he thought, unaware of Paimon mimicking his pull and adding her own sound effects as well. Izuku suddenly frowned. Why is she all the way out here? Where are her parents? The girl, however, did not notice Izuku's serious grimace and addressed him. Paimon's name is Paimon. What is your name? Izuku suddenly looked up and smiled, and the young, hyper girl. I'm Izuku. Izuku Midoriya. But you can call me Deku, he said nervously, trying his best to ignore the pain, now welling up in his finger and legs. The girl tilted her head a little to show her confusion. Deku? The girl asked confused, ignoring Izuku's stutter. Why Deku? It's a nickname, he responded truthfully. My friends call me it all the time. Paimon looked up, her eyes widening. Does that mean that you will be Paimon's friend? The girl asked tentatively, looking quite hopeful. Sure, I don't see why we couldn't be. Paimon squealed in excitement and hugged Izuku's chest, making the boy become even more flustered at the kind, sudden actions of the little girl. She pulled back and smiled, as Izuku suddenly got to his feet and looked at his healed legs in amazement. They didn't even hurt in the slightest anymore. Even the finger that had begun to heal was now fully healed and functional. My limbs, they're fixed. Thank you. That's an amazing quirk you have. Paimon puffed out her tiny chest, but then her proud look quickly morphed into a confused one as she floated back up into the air. Thanks, Paimon is a good healer. But what is a quirk? Is that something you eat? Izuku hid his confusion rather well. She didn't know what he was talking about. Everyone in the world knew about quirks. How come she didn't know? Wait. The man had said his quirk involved realms, meaning that he could possibly be somewhere where quirks didn't exist. But then how was she floating? He would find out later, as right now, the girl was alone. She needed to get back to society, not to be in the middle of the woods with someone like him, who was barely managing to get by. He looked around and didn't see any dangerous animals nearby. No rustling bushes or trees. Relieved by this, Izuku then turned to the girl, who looked at him with confusion, still pondering over his quirk statement. Never mind that, just follow this river that way. The boy paused, taking time to point his finger in the direction where the girl should head. You'll find a path. Follow it to wherever you came from, okay? I'm sorry, I don't know this place too well yet. He made his way to pick up his fishing rod, which now laid on the ground. He then picked up the tool as he turned his back to the girl, throwing her a smile over his shoulder. Well, Izuku said, turning around his head back around so he could see where he was going, now no longer looking at the girl he had just saved. You should watch your balance. It would be bad if you fell into the river again. Izuku then began to slowly trudge forward, heading back toward his temporary house. See you later. Make sure you go back to your parents safely. Izuku then began contemplating what he should have for dinner, as the girl didn't quite provide him with any food. On top of that, there was the new fact that quirks were non-existent in this world, which was another huge fact. Or maybe just the girl didn't know. He doubted it. Izuku then yawned as the boy made his way through the bushes towards his temporary home. He had managed to find some herbs and a rabbit. At least he would eat tonight, even though it wasn't much. Izuku frowned before wincing ever so slightly at the pain through his finger. He had to sacrifice a finger to catch the rabbit. He knew using one for all would damage him. But without recovery girl or any other source of healing, he was downright screwed. He then saw a tiny chimney stack in the distance, indicating that he was approaching his home. He yawned, opened the door, and walked inside the mini-house. There were only a few things in said shelter: a fireplace, a bedroom, and a small bathroom with a shower, which he constantly kept having to run to the river to refill. Sure, bathing in river water was unsanitary, but it was the best he had at the moment. Izuku then trudged over to the fireplace and grabbed a sharp stick off the wall. The green-haired boy then skinned the rabbit and removed the meat from it. Izuku couldn't help but feel a little guilty as he did so. But if he wanted to go home, then he would have to do what he had to. The boy then carefully pierced the meat with the stick and hung it over the fireplace, turning it every minute to make sure he didn't eat any raw meat. He watched it become darker as delicious aromas filled the air in the abode. Right as Izuku was about to turn it again, he heard a noise come from the woods. Izuku looked at the door, and then back at his meat. Probably just imaging things, he thought to himself as he watched the meat roast. After all, I have been alone for quite some time. Izuku felt a sudden pang of sadness overtake him. He thought about his friends and teachers. He knew he would be lucky if he ever saw them again. Boy, did he miss them. Would he ever manage to see them again? No, he would see them again. No matter what it would ta. There was a sudden rustling coming from outside the green-haired boy's door. Izuku opened his door and looked around cautiously with his finger at the ready, just in case he had to unleash a Delaware smash. Suddenly, the bushes left of the boy rustled. Izuku looked at them, a tiny amount of fear in his eyes. What if it was a wild animal? He had killed small animals, but big ones. Was it a bear? A wolf? Did this world even have wolves? The bushes then parted a bit, showing glistening purple eyes. Meat. The creepy voice came out of the bushes, scaring the poor boy to no ends. Izuku raised his hand and took aim at the creature. This was going to hurt him, but it would hurt this mysterious being a lot more. The creature's glistening eyes locked onto Izuku and widened. There was a sudden squeal, and suddenly felt two little arms around his waist, as he got the air knocked out of him and fell to the ground, the branches underneath him breaking with a loud asterisk crack asterisk. The boy opened his eyes to see the world spinning around him. He heard a familiar gasp. "Oh no," the voice cried out. Paimon killed Izuku. Izuku groaned as his vision cleared up, showing the little girl sitting on top of him, grinning sheepishly. "Oh, you're alive. Thank the gods. Paimon is sorry. You looked different from a distance." Izuku just chuckled, while wincing from the pain in his ribs. "It's no problem, Paimon. But why are you here? Didn't the traitor give you directions?" The atmosphere took a sudden turn, from awkward and happy to serious and somewhat depressed as Paimon floated back up into the air and looked off at the side of the woods. Paimon flushed, not knowing where to start out. "Paimon, can't go home." Izuku blinked, confused at this sudden fact. "Why not? Paimon isn't welcome there anymore," Paimon stated with a hint of sadness. Paimon tried to go home, but they threw stuff at Paimon and called Paimon names. Izuku was confused. He didn't know Paimon for long, but she seemed very nice. He couldn't imagine why she was kicked out. "Did you do anything wrong?" Izuku asked as Paimon took on a thoughtful expression. "Paimon plays tricks on village. Paimon played a trick on someone important and was kicked out. Paimon doesn't remember anything after that until meeting you," Paimon admitted as her gaze didn't leave the surrounding woods. Izuku felt confusion at first. Why was she telling him all of this? If a random girl was willing to tell a stranger all of this, that means there must have been no one for her to talk to, no one to help her. He knew exactly what it was like to go through something like that. Being born quirkless, he was used to people making fun of him, and he was honestly used to it. But seeing someone get thrown out of their home and left to drown, the very thought of how they, as Paimon referred to them as, could have treated Paimon made his anger rise. Izuku quickly hid his anger. He forced a smile on his face at the girl before him. "Well, Paimon, you seem like a nice person. So why is it that you were forced out?" Paimon looked up at Izuku. This time the sadness in her gaze was unmissable as she started to slightly tear up. As she quickly hid her face by turning her head, determined not to show the boy she had recently met her tears, as she remembered what they would do if they saw her like this. Izuku suddenly stood up, a look of determination on his usually shy face. He stared at her before smiling. Just like All Might, he thought, before smiling in a way All Might would to reassure someone as Paimon turned her head back to look at him. What he wasn't expecting was for Paimon to start laughing at him, turning in the air where she flew. "Paimon likes that face, Izuku," she giggled as she recovered from her full-blown laughter. "Paimon thinks that face is funny." Izuku chuckled sheepishly. "I guess to a little girl who has never heard of a superhero, a kid mimicking All Might's face must be funny." Paimon suddenly stopped giggling altogether. She looked up at Izuku. She took a deep breath. Izuku looked at the little girl, confused as the leaves in the trees blew in the breeze as birds chirped. The little girl then looked at the boy who stood before her and said, "Will you please take Paimon with you?" Izuku blinked in confusion, tilting his head to the side slightly. "Can you repeat that, Paimon? I didn't understand you well." Paimon stared at an ant on the ground, apparently unable to meet the green-haired boy's gaze. She then swallowed and said it again, this time more clearly so Izuku could understand her. "Will you please take Paimon with you?" Izuku stared at Paimon. He then asked her the million-dollar question. "Why?" Paimon raised her head, so her eyes met Izuku. Truth be told, she didn't know why she wanted to be with this green-haired boy. She felt safer around him. He was a living example of being there for someone in a rough time. She had asked him if she could stay with him. Instead of laughing, walking away, or denying her, he was giving thought to the matter. She could tell he was a good person, and she knew that he was going to go places with his determination to protect others. I said it once, and I'll say it again. No Paimon ships. You're a very kind person. Paimon said, looked at Izuku, who flushed from the sudden compliment. Not to mention that everyone who has met Paimon has not been very kind. Where you met Paimon and stated treating Paimon with respect. So can Paimon live with you for the moment? Izuku looked quite shocked and a bit angry to hear this. To hear that someone who was this old never get treated with respect was a frightening prospect. Izuku looked down at the little girl and gave her a genuine smile. Not an All Might smile, but a normal smile that made her much happier. Oh, of course, Paimon, Izuku stammered a bit, still a bit red from the compliments given to him. I don't live too far from here. Let's catch something to eat, and we can go to my house. Paimon started beaming. Yay, I get to live with Izuku. She then floated around him, giggling at his awe that she could float. She can fly? Izuku thought to himself. If she can fly, then how come she didn't catch herself from falling into the river? Unless her flying Hasamser to Flimmerton, which Shekin T fly forth. But that wouldn't T make a nicense. Imian. If Shekut. Then Paimon was looking at Izuku confused. What is Izuku mumbling about? Izuku looked up, flushing. Oh, sorry Paimon, I do that sometimes. I just think out loud. Izuku then looked up at the sky. They were burning daylight standing out here chatting. It wouldn't be long before sundown at this point. The sky was starting to turn a shade of pink and red. Izuku would have appreciated such beauty if nightfall wasn't imminent. Nightfall meant monsters, which he had learned the hard way during his first night in this world. Come on, he quickly said to Paimon. We should go before we're attacked by monsters or any other animal. Paimon giggled before floating off. Let's go, Izuku. Inside your house we go. Wait, Paimon. That's the wrong way, Izuku shouted before sprinting after the little girl. However, he smiled as he chased after Paimon. He was glad he could help someone, and if they ever found Paimon's village again, Izuku would help change it for the better. In the meantime, he could know more about Paimon's past and help her. After all, if All Might could help as many people as he did, then Izuku knew he could too. Izuku yawned as he got out of bed. As he put his feet on the ground, he heard a squeak of protest. Izuku, who had temporarily forgot what had happened the day before, shot to the other side of the room, thinking he had stepped on a mouse. Instead, there was a very tired, indignant Paimon who was wearing new pajamas that Izuku had bought from the trader on the way home with Paimon the day prior. It had turned out the bear Izuku had scared away almost a week ago was worth a handsome sum. The specific bear had been a problem for ages, attacking visitors and escaping before knights could show up. Izuku had mentioned the bear to Paimon while making his way up to the trader. When the trader heard, he was thrilled. He could now make his way through the forest into the village without having to worry about getting attacked. Izuku had accepted the money to help take care of Paimon and nothing else. He needed nor wanted anything except clothes, food, and to make others happy. He had already done the last bit, the trader embracing Izuku like they were long-lost brothers, thanking him for increasing his business. Izuku had been a bit unnerved at the action, but told the man that he would do it again in a heartbeat if he could help someone. Needless to say, rumors were already going around the village thanks to the trader about Izuku, who had not even taken a single step into the village yet. The Knights of Favonius, the knights that defended the village of Mondstadt, did not know what to make of this green-haired boy. Due to the trader's somewhat over-exaggerated stories of Izuku helping him, the people of Mondstadt had an emotion that the knights had rarely ever seen before: hope. Even with the sighting of dragons in the area, people were beginning to become more hopeful now that supplies and visitors could enter the village without the fear of being attacked. Izuku had seemed to scare off the rest of the species that were main suspects of attacking the visitors and their goods. Izuku had also become a very interesting topic among the Knights of Favonius, more specifically, Kia. Thankfully, the trader had not said Izuku's name, which helped in this situation. However, Kia had put the pieces together and figured that the green-haired miracle worker, this was the nickname people had given Izuku, as they did not know his real name, could be the same person who caused the sonic boom that was heard the day prior. Thankfully for Kia, Amber had finally reached Mondstadt and was going to check the forest today. Izuku, however, was oblivious to what the villagers and knights were thinking, considering he had not been in the village yet. He knew that he would have to go soon. He could only hide in the forest with Paimon for so long. Speaking of Paimon, she had now shot up from her bed and looked around wildly, her tiny chest heaving. Her wide eyes scanned the cabin, over Izuku's hung-up UA tournament uniform, and her gaze finally rested upon Izuku. She then began to calm down. Izuku stared at her, realizing that they were more alike than they realized. She's had a bad experience in her past, just like me. He thought to himself as Paimon suddenly looked Izuku in the eye. Is it okay if Paimon tell Izuku something? Paimon asked. Paimon has heard that talking about how Paimon is feeling helps. Izuku suddenly spoke up. But when he spoke, it was different. It was in a tone of understanding and of pain. I think I understand. You've had a bad experience with the people in your village. You feel alone and a bit betrayed. Paimon looked up at Izuku in pure astonishment. He had not stuttered once. Gone was the scared, nervous look in his eyes. Instead, there was pure determination, understanding, and kindheartedness. Izuku spoke again in the soft, but firm voice. I've been where you were. I was an outcast in my village too. People made fun of me because I didn't get that strength you saw yesterday until I was much older. People made fun of me and called me Deku. It meant useless Izuku. Paimon stares at him with sympathy and a slight bit of happiness. He knew what it was like to be like her. But, Izuku said looking out the window and smiling. I'm glad I didn't give up. If I did, then I couldn't have helped or saved anyone. I don't regret anything. People have told me to kill myself and to give up. But I didn't. So why should you? Izuku grinned at Paimon, who was beginning to tear up. He smiled at Paimon and asked her a question. What's your dream, Paimon? Your goal in life? Paimon's eyes widened even more. No one in her life had ever asked her that question. Paimon's D-dream is to become L leader of my village, and to H help everyone in the V village, she said in a shaky voice. Izuku grinned and stated something that would change the little girl's life forever. That's an awesome dream. I'm sure you can do it if you try hard enough. I'll help you every step of the way. Izuku was interrupted by Paimon bursting into tears and hugging Izuku. Thank you, Izuku. She mumbled, and when she pulled back, her wet eyes were filled with a new sense of determination. Paimon will become the leader for you and Paimon. Izuku nodded. I know you won't let either of us down. Right as Paimon nodded determinedly, Izuku's stomach let out an unearthly growl. Paimon then broke into hysterical laughter as Izuku turned a shade of crimson. Well, Izuku stuttered, embarrassed because of the sudden interruption. Let's get some bee breakfast. I'll catch us a fish. Paimon only laughed harder, now amused at how Izuku went from determined to nervous in under a second. Izuku sighed as he chucked a little. It was going to be a long day. Izuku was walking with a makeshift spear in his hand. He didn't want to risk using one for all again. He had told Paimon how using his quirk broke him. Paimon understood quickly, considering she was present when Izuku had used his quirk to save her. Paimon was floating around Izuku's head in circles. Paimon want fish today. No wait, bear. No wait, deer. And Izuku tuned her out at this point. He sighed as she pointed out every single animal on their walk and asked if it were edible. More than half of the animals were edible, but Izuku knew that she would eat so much she would get sick, so he told her no and walked on. But Paimon didn't let Izuku's blunt replies stop her. On the contrary, she became more persistent and annoying as time went on. As Paimon listed basically every animal alive asking if it were edible or not, Izuku had stopped paying attention and was suddenly overcome with worry. He thought of someone he had not thought of since his arrival here, his mother. He was suddenly overcome with worry about his mother and what she would think about his disappearance. Inko Midoriya was a very good person and mother. When Izuku was 4, he had watched an All Might video with his mother, telling her that he wanted to be like him when he grew up. At the time she encouraged him, telling him that he could do it. However, as time went on, she stopped encouraging him. Not that she wanted to, but because she was basically forced to. The doctor Izuku had visited told him he was quirkless because of an extra toe joint. However, when Izuku revealed to his mom that his quirk had manifested later, she was thrilled. She had bursted into tears when she had heard this, and told him how happy she was for him, and told him something that he wanted to hear for a long time, that he could become a hero. He was now scared for his mom, and what they would tell her to cover up Izuku's vanishment, especially considering that she did not have a husband to console her. Hey Izuku, Paimon said looking over a hill, unaware that Izuku was now grinding his teeth. Is that edible? I don't know Paimon. Izuku said angrily, still unable to stop his stutter, even when he was angry or annoyed. Why don't you tell me? Paimon looked over the hill with a thoughtful expression on her face. It has wings, it's really big, and Paimon suddenly turned completely pale. She was beginning to shake. Paimon? Izuku asked as he walked up the hill next to the girl and waved his hand in her face. He got no response. What's going on? Why are you shaking? Paimon still made no response as she only began to shake harder. Izuku frowned and looked at what she was staring at. Izuku had to bite his tongue to stop himself from screaming. He ignored the foul taste of blood rising in his mouth. He stared ahead in shock. Right there, in front of them, was an enormous blue dragon. It looked as though God himself had painted the majestic creature. Blue fire came out of its eyes as its ocean blue claws got a good grip on the grass. The dragon looked around the forest, waving its majestic head, causing the animals in the area to scatter. Is he talking to a D-dragon? Paimon whispered as she hid behind Izuku. Izuku blinked in confusion before looking at who he was. A boy stood there, roughly Izuku's age, maybe even younger. He wore a green hat, pants, and cape along with a white and black shirt. A graceful, calm expression adorned his features as he spoke to the dragon. It's okay, the boy said it as though he were talking to a baby. Don't be afraid. It's all right now. I'm back. The boy then reached up and stroked the dragon's head, so the dragon put its head down for the boy to reach more easily. That's sweet, Izuku thought. Barely had the thought left his head when a sudden pain shot through his body. The power of One for All began to emerge from him as he panted while on his knees and hands. The dragon suddenly got up and let out a huge roar. The boy's peaceful expression had disappeared. Who's there? He demanded as the dragon's roar began to get louder. With one final suspicious look around the area, the boy vanished into thin air, leaving the dragon behind. The dragon then let out one final roar and flew off into the sky. Izuku blinked. The pain was gone, and One for All had hidden itself once more. Paimon looked at Izuku in shock, and even more awe than she had when he had saved her. Before Paimon could say anything, Izuku gazed up at where the dragon had been. What's that? He asked as he ignored his body's protests of the pain from One for All. There was a red, teardrop-shaped stone that was glowing red. It seemed to emit dark energy. Izuku and Paimon slowly and cautiously approached it. Paimon's never seen a stone like this before, so Paimon can't tell what it is. Paimon stated as she and Izuku analyzed the glistening red stone before them. Best Paimon put this away for now, just in case it's dangerous. Paimon and Izuku then continued their walking, talking about the dragon and boy they saw. While Paimon was making comments on how big the dragon was and its beauty, Izuku was thinking back to the boy they saw. He had appeared nice until the dragon flew away. Izuku knew that this boy and dragon had to do something with One for All, and he intended on finding out what. Hey Izuku, Paimon caught Izuku off guard, as he was still thinking about the boy. Why did you activate that ability of yours right then? Izuku frowned a bit. As he turned to respond to her, a feminine voice that wasn't Paimon's filled the air. Hey you, stop right there. Izuku and Paimon looked around, both slightly miffed at being interrupted. All of a sudden, a girl jumped off of a nearby slope and rolled when she hit the ground. When she recovered, she stumbled a bit before catching herself. She then turned around wearing a smug expression. Izuku got a good look at the girl. She had golden eyes and long, dark brown hair which cascaded down her back. She wore a jumper-like outfit made of leather, a hoodie, and red and white stockings with gold patterns. Something Izuku noticed about the girl was that she had a red cloth around her head, which were tied into bunny ears. Izuku's face began redden. But he kept eye contact with the girl who approached he and Paimon carefully. She then looked Izuku up and down, as though she were judging his every movement. Before Izuku could say anything, a grin appeared on her face as a bow appeared in her hand. I caught you red-handed, miracle worker, she shouted before placing an arrow into the bow and aiming it at an angered Paimon and bewildered Izuku. Now face the wrath of the outrider of the Knights of Favonius. She fired the arrow, which had burst into flames. Izuku then suddenly heard a shriek as he looked to his side and saw Paimon cowering behind him. His eyes suddenly regained the determined look that Paimon had seen in them that morning. I need to do something, Izuku thought as One for All began charging through his right middle finger. I won't let anyone get hurt. He took aim at the flying arrow and amber and yelled to the heavens. Delaware smash. Another sonic boom went off as the air pressure caused the arrow and amber to fly a great distance away into a rock. Trees in the clearing where Izuku had aimed were ripped to shreds. Izuku gasped as the pain from his finger settled in. He stumbled a little, but did not lose his balance. Paimon will never get used to that, came an odd voice from behind him. He turned around and saw Paimon staring at him again with starry eyes. He chuckled sheepishly as she healed his finger when he suddenly heard a gasp. When he turned around, he saw Amber getting up from the rubble. The attack had narrowly missed her. Her eyes widened to the size of plates when she saw what a single flick of his finger did. She turned around looking Izuku in the eye. Lucky as a shot," she stammered. Won't happen again. I will defeat you for the K-Knights of F. Favonius." Izuku got out of his fighting position. It was obvious that this girl would be lucky if she could even fire another arrow, let alone at him. She was shaking so much any other person thought she had seen a ghost. Her face had lost all of its color after seeing Izuku's power demonstrated. She pulled out her bow, forcing herself to take a shot. She loaded the arrow in when she noticed something strange. Izuku was doing nothing to stop it, he just stared at her, his hands in his pockets. She gave a shaky grin. "So, that W was all the P power you had, huh? Why, you scared me F for a minute. I'll give you that much." Izuku, however, stared at her with an impassive expression. She loaded the arrow and aimed again at Izuku, who was surprised at how quickly she recovered from his power. She was still slightly shaking, but donned a serious look. "Now," she yelled. "You will not hurt anyone in the ville." Right before she could fire, or let alone finish her sentence, a giant fruit fell from a tree right on her head. She stood still for a minute, and then passed out on the ground, the fruit and pressure from Izuku's attack finally reaching her. Paimon blinked at the fallen figure. She then had a dreamy expression. "Does Izuku think that the witch had any food on her?" Izuku sighed. Of course, that was the first thing Paimon thought of. It wasn't the fact they were attacked. It was the fact that she was hungry. "I don't know," he responded. "She's not a witch, and if she did, we wouldn't take it." Izuku then walked over and picked up the girl and threw her over his shoulder, blushing at the contact. But," he continued, "we can't just leave her here. It would make us know than V villains if we left her." Paimon gave Izuku a toothy grin. "All right. If Izuku say it's okay, Paimon will trust you. But she's not sleeping in Paimon's bed." Izuku sighed. "You don't have a B bed yet. We're still getting YU1. Plus, I don't think she's staying that long." Paimon shrugged, just saying, she said happily as she suddenly gasped. "Izuku, that reminds me." Izuku looked at her curiously. "What is it?" Paimon floated around happily. "Let's have fish for dinner." Izuku felt his eye twitch as he readjusted the girl onto his other shoulder and began to walk back towards the house. It was only 11 in the morning, and he already wanted the day to end. He looked up at the sky and prayed that he wouldn't run into anyone else for a while. Little did Izuku know, the exact opposite was going to happen. "Everyone, please give us 5 more minutes. We cannot find the contestant to go up against Contest Todoroki." The announcement blared across the stadium as Shadow Todoroki, a white and red-haired boy, whose quirk was half hot, half cold, stood in the middle of the arena, tapping his foot impatiently. Like Izuku, he also had a very troubled past. His mother had left a hideous scar on his face, due to his father, Endeavor Todoroki, driving her to the brink of insanity. He grit his teeth as a few flames suddenly danced around his left hand. He quickly put them out, not wanting to resort to his quirk. 5 minutes later, a sudden announcement blared across the stadium. Izuku Midoriya has not shown up for his match, and is hereby disqualified. The winner by default is Shadow Todoroki. Todoroki was taken aback. Midoriya had not shown up. Impossible. Only a few hours ago had Todoroki told Midoriya about his past, and Midoriya telling him that he wouldn't give up no matter what Shadow had said. Todoroki frowned. Izuku did not seem like the person to lie. Perhaps something had happened to him. The crowd seemed concerned. They had seen what Izuku had done against Shinso, and wanted to see his power drawn out. The quirkless in the stadium had wanted to see what Izuku would resort to in order to defeat Todoroki. Uneasy murmuring drifted across the stadium. Izuku's friends looked confused and a little scared. What do you mean disqualified?" Uraraka asked, confused. "Where's Izuku? Why didn't he show up for his match?" Ilda had pushed his glasses a little higher, trying to look professional, but failing due to his visible concern over his friend. "I do not know," Ilda stated calmly. "But Izuku isn't the type to give up suddenly. I do not doubt that something may have happened to him." In the back of the stadium, Toshinori Yagi looked around. He frowned and looked in the tunnel where Izuku should have emerged. "Young Midoriya," Toshinori thought to himself. "Where are you?" His thoughts were suddenly interrupted when Izawa, Class 1A's teacher, and also known as the Pro Hero Eraserhead, walked in looking tired. But underneath his usual tired look, there was a serious, focused look. Aizawa, while he was lazy at times, did not let a single one of his students get hurt or left behind. Aizawa looked at Toshinori. "Do you know where he is?" Heast All Might, even though he already knew the answer. He was proven correct when All Might shook his head. The worry in his gaze was unmissable. "I don't understand," Toshinori muttered as he saw Katsuki Bakugo walk out of the arena, most likely to give Izuku a few choice words. Where in the world could he be? "Sir." All Might and Eraserhead turned around to see a security guard holding a man by his arm. "Sir," according to Izuku Midoriya's friends, they saw this man leaving the hallway Izuku had been in moments before. "We think he has something to do with his disappearance." The man had an impassive expression on his face. He looked at Eraserhead and Toshinori in the eye. Eraserhead's hair flew up as his eyes glowed red. "I'll ask this once, or else you got to the police. Did you or did you not have to do with the disappearance of Izuku Midoriya?" The man looked Aizawa in the eye. "Yes, I did," he said in an even tone. Aizawa and Toshinori looked a bit taken aback, not unlike how Todoroki had looked minutes earlier. "Where is he now?" All Might pressed as Aizawa's hair went down a little. The man sighed and ripped his arm out of the grip of the security guard. Toshinori cocked an eyebrow as Eraserhead's hair flew up again, only to retreat when the man sighed and sat down on a chair next to the wall. The man sighed. "Where should I begin? Paimon thinks we should eat her." "We're not going to eat her, Paimon." "Then why did Izuku help him?" "Because it's the right thing to do." Amber heard those voices swimming around her head. She couldn't remember what happened. She had. What was she doing? Who were these people? "The witch might try to attack Izuku if the witch gets up," said a light, cute voice. "Yes, she won't." Izuku, that was the boy's name, apparently rang through her head. It sounded familiar. And that's when she remembered. Everything came back at once. It started with her confrontation of Izuku. It then ranged from that to Izuku's powerful attack, to her getting thrown into a rock. She remembered Izuku's powerful attack, and how it completely destroyed the trees in its way. Her eyes shot open. The green-haired boy and white-haired girl looked at her as she sat up too fast, and winced at the sudden throbbing in her head. "Hey," came the voice of Izuku, who peered down at Amber, who was still rubbing her head. Amber stared at Izuku for a moment, her eyes wide. She looked him up and down, from his red shoes to his fluffy, green hair. She stared. And then she let out an ear-piercing scream. "Oh," Paimon yelled, holding her little ears. Izuku winced slightly, but didn't say anything. Amber attempted to jump up and summon her bow, but her head injury permitted her to do so. What was supposed to happen is that she would jump up, aim her bow, they would beg and cry, and she would escort them to jail. But that isn't what happened. Amber attempted to jump up, but stumbled and smacked her head on the ceiling of the cabin. She then fell over, the ground approaching her quickly. She shut her eyes. Great. She was about to get even more injured than she already was. But right before she hit the ground, she felt two strong arms catch her. She opened her eyes to see the face of her hero. Perhaps Kia had dealt with the boy and came in to help her. But she looked up and saw the face of Izuku staring down at her nervously. Amber suddenly looked down her face, blushing bright red. His arms were still wrapped around her stomach and waist to keep her from falling. "Get off of me," she roared. She pushed with all of her might, but since she was in a weakened state, it only made Izuku stumble a little before dropping her on the bed. Amber suddenly sat up, pointing a blaming finger at Izuku. "Miracle worker," she had tried to say it seriously, but due to her injured state from the fruit and one for all flick, and because of her embarrassment, she had squeaked it out while still a chase of crimson. "You are hereby under arrest for attacking a knight of Favianus. Anything you saw." She was interrupted by a loud growling sound from her stomach, as if to add to her already growing embarrassment. Izuku blinked as Paimon giggled at the brown-haired girl's misfortune. "Would why you like something to eat?" Izuku stuttered slightly, still not knowing for sure if she would attack or not. "Shut up," she exclaimed, still red from the contact she had made with Izuku. She was the outrider of the Knights of Favonius. People looked up to her and wanted to be more like her. And here she was, in a run-down little wooden cabin, being asked if she needed food. As if she was never going to accept. Nope. The hunger growing in her stomach was nothing. Absolutely not. "I'll take something to eat," she had mumbled quietly. No one needed to know this had ever happened. She would just take the food, get back to full strength, arrest him and his. Sister? Strange. They didn't really look alike. Sure. Izuku nodded frantically and gave her an apple. Enjoy. Amber smirked. It seemed she was beginning to pressure the boy. Her mere presence was enough to send him into stuttering. Paimon had seen her smirk at Izuku's stuttering and rolled her eyes. Amber quickly ate the fruit, while Izuku decided to question her a bit. Not too little, or they wouldn't get real answers. Not too many, or she would realize what he was doing. So, these K-Nights. Izuku began, his gaze not leaving Amber. Can you tell me what you guys do? Ha! She laughed as though he had said something funny. As if a simple forest dweller like you could understand the wonders of being part of the Knights of Favianus. We protect the people of Mondstadt and earn fame, money, and praises for it. Sometimes, the leader king of the village himself comes down to thank us for our service. Amber finished proudly, still munching away on the apple cutely. Paimon had growled a bit at the simple forest dweller part, which caused Amber to look over at her in confusion. What's that? Amber asked confusedly. Your mascot or something? Izuku suddenly panicked. He had not had shown Paimon to anyone, so it would make sense why they would be confused. All right, Izuku. Izuku thought to himself quickly while Amber was awaiting a response. Say something, anything. Just something to get her of your back. Mascot? Paimon had shouted at the brown-haired girl. How dare Amber? Paimon is Izuku's loyal companion. He saved Paimon from an untimely demise, so Paimon Emergency food, Izuku had blurted out. It was the first thing that came to his mind after all. He was very hungry. Izuku looked up, realizing he had said it aloud. Amber went from confused to snickering to full-blown laugher, while Paimon sat there flabbergasted. Izuku had turned a bit redder at this, but knew it wasn't the time to be embarrassed. He needed to gather information. After he had quickly apologized to Paimon, who had been less forgiving than he thought he stated. I heard you guys wanted to arrest me. Why is that? I never stepped foot into your village. Ah, right, Amber giggled, wiping a tear from her eye. You're wanted by the Knights of Favonius because you're the prime suspect of causing the sonic boom the other day, which caused the city to go into a panic. She suddenly looked very seriously at Izuku and Paimon, both who had an impassive look on their faces. It was you, wasn't it, miracle worker? Why, yes it was, Izuku said, but he looked confused. Also, why do you keep calling me miracle worker? I just live here in the forest by myself and Paimon. It's a nickname you got after you killed or scared away a bear or something, Amber said, waving it off as though the thought were an annoying fly. But you're under arrest. You scared multiple people that day. Because I had to save Paimon, Izuku said seriously, his stutter gone. She was going to drown in a river if I didn't help her. Amber raised an eyebrow and looked at Paimon for confirmation, which in response the white-haired girl nodded. It's true, Paimon said, confirming Izuku's words. Paimon would have died if not for Izuku, she said happily as she hugged Izuku tightly. Paimon owes her life to Izuku, she finished, ignoring Izuku's reddening face. Amber was completely quiet. She looked from Izuku back to Paimon. She then sighed. All right. I won't arrest you, but you will have to come with me. You need to explain to our leader why you did what you did. Since you were doing the right thing, I'll try and help you too. Amber finished, but she had whispered the last part, too embarrassed to say it loudly. Paimon said, squinting her eyes, staring at Amber accusingly. Can we trust the witch Izuku? Hey, Amber shouted. I am not a witch. Amber then shook her head a little and smirked. I'll have you know that my name is Amber. I'm the outrider of the Knights of F. We know. Izuku and Paimon responded simultaneously. Izuku was sweeping and Paimon was floating around, obviously unconcerned about what the brown-haired girl was saying. Hey, Amber yelled, getting their attention. They looked at her with a look of disinterest. She was seething with anger now. No one in her life had been this rude to her. Amber was always used to people paying respect to her, to look up to her. People would look up at her, and the kids in the village would always yell how they would become a respectful warrior like she was. However, these two were different. She had told them personally that she was the outrider of the knights. And what kind of reaction did she get? Boredom. Disinterest. They seemed rather unconcerned with Amber and her position. Honestly, she couldn't care less either. She didn't care what the emergency food had to say about her. But why did she care about Izuku's opinion out of nowhere? She quickly adapted a smug persona. I can see that I'll have to take you clowns to the city. Let's hope that me walking with people like you doesn't lower my image. Izuku grinned at her, while Paimon glowered. Thanks, Amber, he said happily, ignoring the insult at the end. Can't wait to meet your leader, if he's even more skilled than you are. Amber's face flushed at the sudden comment. Well, she coughed, trying to ignore the comment. In a full-out fight, I'd say we're even. He just has the brains to be the leader. Oh, Paimon said, grinning smugly. That means Amber is the dumb one of the group. Amber looked livid. Listen, you little snowflake, she was going to yell. I'm only helping you for our Vil. She was going to finish. She was going to tell them how lucky they were that someone like her was helping them. But she didn't, as Izuku took out some ointment and began to treat Amber's head wound. Amber turned an even brighter shade of red and didn't meet Izuku's eyes. Paimon giggled at the funny expression on Amber's face. When Izuku gave her the thumbs up, she shot out of the bed she was in. All right, she squeaked as she crossed the room in a single leap. Let's leave now, and whatever you do, do not tell anyone that you're the miracle worker. Amber finished in a dangerous voice, as Izuku nodded frantically. Perfect, Amber said as she nodded at Izuku and glanced at Paimon, who stuck her tongue out at her from behind Izuku. Amber glowered. Shall we get going? Oh, all right, Izuku stammered, following her out the door, with Paimon at his heels. All right, Amber grinned. Let's get going then. She skipped away, stopping and began beckoning them to follow her. Paimon says we ditch the witch and go. Paimon whispered to Izuku. Izuku shook his head. She seems nice enough, Izuku said as smiled reassuringly at Paimon, who frowned a bit before sighing and nodding. They followed the impatient Amber as they made their way through the forest. Besides, Izuku thought to himself, as long as I don't reveal myself, I'll be fine. How bad can it be? Little did the green-haired boy know, he would make a very heroic impact on the city. Toshinori Yagi and Aizawa looked at the man with their faces giving nothing away. The man had told them everything that had happened. He had not let a single detail about that happen. He told them how he ran into the green-haired boy, how excited Izuku was, and how his own excitement got him into this predicament. Aizawa sighed. Of course. The green-haired problem child had gotten himself into another situation. It was bad enough when he had almost gotten killed by Shigaraki and Namu. But no, he just had to have done something like this. He knew that it wasn't entirely Izuku's fault, but the boy had a knack for being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Aizawa looked at the man in the eyes. The man looked back quite impassively. So, let me get this straight. You were coming to congratulate Shinso because you wanted him to recruit at your agency. That's correct, the man said, nodding. After all, who wouldn't want such a strong-minded kid? He then spun on one foot and posed flamboyantly. I know I woo MPH. He was quickly silenced thanks to Aizawa's scarf. Enough, Aizawa hissed. How long will it take you to bring back Izuku, sir? The eccentric man scratched his neck in thought. He snapped his fingers. Don't know. Aizawa and Toshinori looked at the odd man with deadpan expressions. This man wasn't being the least bit helpful. Toshinori glanced at Yagi, who nodded. They had tried to encourage the strange man to tell them more one way. Now they were going to have to try it the other way. Izuku groaned to himself as Amber yelled at a teasing Paimon for the umpteenth time. It had turned out that the forest he had resided in was farther from Mondstadt than he had thought. Amber, while she was guiding him willingly, sent him dubious looks from where she walked, while taking breaks from yelling at Paimon. He couldn't blame her. She had been to that forest multiple times in her life, and not once had she ever seen him. Izuku was afraid this might happen. He then gained a determined look. If she and everyone else here didn't trust him, he would just have to earn it. How hard could it be? They walked for a long while. He was finally able to drown out the arguing voices of Paimon and Amber by focusing on the nature around him. It was gorgeous. The crystal clear water was so clean and visible that you could see the fish swimming near the rocks at the bottom. White, fluffy clouds dotted the sky. Just then, as though God himself granted Izuku a chance, rustling was suddenly heard. Paimon, Amber, and Izuku looked on warily as a huge creature appeared out of the woods. The creature appeared to be made out of tree bark, had yellow eyes, and a huge body with what appeared to be mud whips, and had no feet, just a pile of mud that carried itself everywhere. Amber gasped. The Ocorn. It's a one-of-a-kind creature that eats anything that strays into its territory. It's a rank 5 monster. With shaking hands, she pulled out her bow and took aim. As much as I despise this option, it appears that I will have to work with you. She shook her head as though she herself couldn't believe what she said. Be on your guard. They didn't need to be told twice. Izuku got into a fighting stance as Paimon got behind him whimpering. The Oakhorn let out a primal roar and shot a spear made of wood at Amber. Said girl smirked as she fired an arrow, which burst into flames. The arrow met its target dead on. The monster howled as the arrow struck its right eye. It then shot a sharp piece of bark at Izuku and Amber. Izuku quickly grabbed Paimon and leaped out of the path of the attack. Amber, however, was not as fortunate. The sharp bark embedded itself into her shoulder as she let out a shriek of pain. "Oh no!" Paimon gasped as she saw Amber crumple while holding her shoulder. Suddenly Paimon froze as she saw Izuku stiffen from in front of her. Izuku, Paimon stuttered. She's got I-at-sea covered. And after all, she's the OO outrider of the K-Nig. Izuku grabbed Paimon bridal style and shot himself like a cannon at the fallen Amber. Amber widened her eyes when she saw the screaming Paimon and determined Izuku coming towards her. "And no, I'm the O outrider of Mondstadt. I will not let people throw their lives away from me." "Stay back," Amber croaked. But Izuku did not halt. He kept running towards the giant monster and the struggling girl. He moved Paimon onto his back. Paimon held onto Izuku as tightly as she could. Izuku then leapt into the air and at the monster, which had just noticed him. The monster let out a roar as Izuku let out a shout. "Detriot smash!" The monster's roar turned into what could only be classified as a scream before the punch made hit it head on. The punch was so strong that not only was the monster's stomach blown to bits, but the rest of it as well. The trees behind it were blown away, and the mountain that lay behind the forest had boulders tumbling down it, as the force of the punch had disturbed it. Amber sat there. The pain in her shoulder could not be compared to the amount of shock that she felt. Now that she wasn't the one being punched, she saw the strong punch in all its might. She swallowed nervously, trying to get rid of her fear. She looked up and saw something strange. Izuku was gasping, and his arm appeared broken, with Paimon healing it. She had already been told earlier on the walk by the green-haired boy that the ability damaged him when he used it, so he needed Paimon's healing abolites. However, that was not the strange thing. Upon further inspection, she saw that a bit of the lightning that came off Izuku's arm was sparking on his shoulder. The little spark then traveled from his shoulder onto Paimon, who didn't notice. The spark then suddenly stopped and was absorbed into her skin. What was that? Amber thought. She looked over at the pain-stricken Izuku and the doting Paimon. Neither one seemed to notice the strange spark or its disappearance. She was suddenly interrupted when Izuku and Paimon approached her. She tried to stand, only to fall right onto Izuku, who fell onto the ground with her. She blushed, the color of her face matching her red clothes. Izuku turned even brighter than that, to the point where any other human would think that he had really bad sunburns. Paimon, Izuku stuttered as he carefully placed Amber onto the ground. She noticed that his determined Dementor was gone. "See, could you please heal Amber?" Paimon blinked before smirking, causally flying around them with an air of superiority. Only if the witch says that Paimon is better than her and gives her free meat. Amber scowled. "You little Paimon," said Izuku sternly before giving her a little bop on the head. "She helped us. Help her." Paimon stuck her tongue out at Izuku. But then she glanced at the hurt Amber, and back at the indignant Izuku. The little girl pondered for a moment before letting out a sigh as she floated over to the brown-haired girl and healed her shoulder in a little light show. Amber looked on in amazement as the wound sealed itself shut. She made her way to get up, groaning slightly as she tried to put her feet under her, when a hand suddenly came down to help her up. She looked up and saw Izuku offering her hand. I'm glad you're okay," Izuku stammered. Are you hurt anywhere else?" Amber blinked. When Izuku's words reached her, her face resembled a tomato. She suddenly shot up off the ground. "I'm fine," she announced loudly to Izuku's surprise. She then stopped and turned around. She bowed to Paimon, thanking her, though it sounded very forced, and asked if she could talk to Izuku for a moment. She quickly brought Izuku aside and looked him in the eye. "Listen," Amber began. "I am very grateful that you saved my life. But what you did was reckless. Unless you're part of the Knights, you shouldn't pull stunts like that." She finished. Izuku suddenly had a thought. Amber turned on her heel, when she was suddenly stopped when Izuku said, "Wait." Amber looked at him appraisingly. "What is it?" Izuku looked her right in the eye and asked her a question that changed the fate of the village forever. Aizawa sighed as the man let out another scream. "We aren't even doing anything yet," he roared at the scared man. This eccentric man was wearing his patience thin, which was quite an achievement. It was even more of an achievement to have Toshinori pissed at him, which he had managed quite easily due to his offhand questions. Eventually, Toshinori had to use the bathroom. He then left the room, transformed into All Might, walked back in. Aizawa looked quite relieved when he saw All Might walk in. The man, on the other hand, was completely terrified. Hi All Might. The man said nervously. How see can I? You can help me by telling me the location of my student. All Might said in his booming voice. All right, the man said shivering. Look, I don't know. I'm sorry. He broke the portal, and I have no idea where he went. One thing's for certain, however. All Might and Aizawa looked on at him in interest and anger. Time's a funny thing in those realms. Izuku's probably been in there for months according to himself. But in reality, he's only been gone for 30 minutes here. All Might and Aizawa sighed. The man was obviously terrified, so he wasn't a villain, nor was he making anything up on a whim. He was just a confused man who met an overexcited boy and got carried away. Will you help us out and tell us about your quirk some more? Aizawa asked. The man nodded, frantically casting terrified glances at the looming figure of All Might. However, as they kept talking, they were unaware that they were being listened to. The boy listening to them bit his lip in frustration when he heard that Izuku disappeared. What was he going to tell Izuku's friends? They would think he had done something. Damn it, Deku. The boy murmured to himself. You better be alive and okay, you bastard. An angry Katsuki Bakugo walked out of the hallway, wondering how Izuku's friends would react when he told them. Amber blinked, as though she couldn't understand what she had just heard. What? She asked again, to make sure her hearing was working correctly. Why, you heard me. Izuku stammered a bit before collecting himself. I would like to join the Knights of Favonius. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Izuku waited for a response. Amber just stared at him, eyes wide, like she couldn't believe what he had said. And then she burst out into hysterical laughter. Izuku looked on in confusion as Amber fell to her knees in laughter. Paimon, who was listening without either of them knowing, was scowling as they watched as Amber hold her sides in laughter. Amber wiped tears from her eyes. Oh, okay. Hee hee. She cleared her throat. Anyway, what's the real question? Izuku's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. I said I want to join the Knights. Amber looked at him, an eyebrow raised. No, she said blandly. And who are you to decide that? Izuku countered. I am the outrider of the Neg. We know that already, Paimon had shouted it this time. The witch mentioned it over 10 times. Who are you calling a witch, you little snowball? Amber roared back. Paimon looked like she was on the verge of punching Amber when something unexpected happened. She didn't. On the way to the city, Paimon must have tried to punch Amber every time she so much had looked at her. She had tried, but her punches were ineffective. Amber would just laugh at the feeble attempts, which would make Paimon even angrier. It reminded Paimon of the people in her village, to some extent. But this time was different. Paimon had gone from seething to cool in a second. Alrighty. Paimon squeaked with a smirk. But the witch has to let Izuku try out for the Knights then. Amber scoffed, ignoring the insult. And why do I have to do that? Izuku saved the witch from death. So it is only fair that witch lets Izuku try out. Amber frowned. That option had not applied to her yet. Wouldn't it be better to have him try out? That way, she could say, I told you so, to the little white-haired devil. But why did a little bit of her want Izuku to stay? All right, she said, ridding herself of that strange feeling. He can try out. But I'm warning you, Amber explained. It is not easy at all to get into the Knights of Favonius. For one, you're going to have to control your strength. Izuku nodded determinedly. Amber sighed. How did I get myself dragged into this? The brown-haired girl thought to herself. Right then, Amber announced, picking up something the monster had dropped. She looked back at Izuku. One last thing. When we get to the village, we're going to buy you a weapon. You're useless if you can't fight after a single punch. She stated as Izuku nodded once more. All right. Amber nodded. Onward to Mondstadt. It was a long trip. Izuku kept looking around at the rivers and tall mountains, while Paimon started a so far non-hostile conversation with Amber. They both learned some things about Amber. For one, she lived her whole life in the village, and became the outrider because of her sharp shooting and determination. By the way, Amber brought it up, as they were eating a snack on the way. Did you two hear of the dragons that have recently appeared in the area? Izuku and Paimon stiffened. They had not once mentioned to her, or anyone else of the dragon they had seen. But since she had brought it up, why not answer honestly? Actually, Izuku began, choosing his words very carefully. He did not want Amber to know about the teardrop-shaped song yet. We did see one. A big blue one. Amber's undivided attention was upon Izuku. Really? You saw one? Yup. Izuku said as Paimon looked at him ready to jump into the conversation in case one of his lies went wrong. We only got a glimpse though. It came over our house. Amber nodded while looking out the gorgeous mountain range. Izuku had no idea what was going through her mind. But at least one thing was for certain. She wasn't very suspicious of him anymore. Unseen by Izuku and the lost in thought Amber, Paimon scratched the back of her neck. It had been itchy ever since she had healed Izuku. It was probably nothing, probably just a bug bite. Here we are, Amber announced. In front of them stood enormous stone walls and what appeared to be a magnificent city. Izuku could hear much chatter and yelling from inside the city. Paimon got behind Izuku, slightly scared of the humongous town in front of them. Amber turned around with a grin. Welcome to Mondstadt. Izuku looked around in awe as Paimon sniffed the air. The town they had entered was as every bit as magnificent as Amber described it, and then some. There was much chatter coming from townsfolk as they went about their daily lives. There was much trading, buying, and selling to see, and Izuku had only just walked in. If the entrance had this much activity going on, then the rest of the village must be thriving. Paimon's mouth was watering as she smelled the air. Izuku. Paimon smells meat. Izuku chuckled. We will get something to eat in a bit, oh okay? As Paimon nodded frantically, Amber was standing over to the side, lost in her thoughts. This random green-haired boy had caught her attention. The storm terror, that's what the villagers were calling it, was making life in the village much harder. And yet, this boy had not only seen it, but had come to it face to face, and he didn't look terrified. She had questioned him, and he had answered honestly. She knew he was still hiding important information from her, but she would get that out of him over time. But what could he be hiding? A secret about the storm terror? No, he would have told her about it already. As Amber was thinking, a group of little kids, ranging from 6-11 years of age, ran up to her and began jumping up and down. Amber, Amber, the kids shouted gleefully. Amber looked over to the kids and then back at Paimon and Izuku. Izuku waved it off, telling her it was fine, while Paimon was tugging on Izuku's sleeve, trying to bring him over to a delicious-smelling condiment stand. Amber nodded as she crouched down to meet the kids. Hey guys, the brown-haired girl said enthusiastically as she ruffled their hair as they laughed. Did you defend the village while I was away? As the kids yelled happily, Izuku couldn't help but smile. He had heard that she had fans, but he had expected older fans. Still, it was admirable that she was already a role model for kids here. While Izuku looked on smiling, one of the kids, who had pulled himself away from Amber, noticed him. Hey, the kid shouted. Who are you? An intruder? The young boy demanded as he pulled out a slingshot. Izuku put up his hands. And no, just a tea traveler who's visiting. The boy laughed. See that, guys? We got him scared. The group of kids ran away from Amber and ran up to Izuku, who was a little nervous under all of the gazes. He doesn't look very tough. A little girl commented as a boy next to her nodded. Yeah, look at his weird clothes too. Amber, is he your boyfriend? Amber had turned a bright shade of red. Thankfully, Izuku was focusing on the other kid's comment, so he hadn't heard the comment the little boy had made about he and Amber. Amber, on the other hand, was not faring as well. Paimon wasn't paying attention to the kids' teasing of Izuku and was immersed in a conversation with a butcher, whose meat was on sale. Yeah, another kid said. I mean, look at his green hair. Amber's eyes widened. The kids had heard rumors about the miracle worker, but they didn't recognize him at the moment. The brown-haired girl grabbed Izuku by his wrist and gave the kids a quick farewell. She quickly brought him over to the armor store, run by an impatient man who, after many minutes of negotiating and arguing, gave her a red hat. After the outrider paid, he quickly shooed her away, earning a little scowl from the girl. Meanwhile, Izuku had the bright red hat thrown onto him as he sat with a whimpering Paimon, who was staring at the discount meat stand longingly. Oh, all right, Amber said, whose face was still bright red from the boyfriend comment. She clapped her hands. I have some business to attend to, but whenever you're ready, I'll be waiting for you at the city's high ground. I'll mark it on this map. She pulled out a map and gave it to Izuku. You can't go anywhere without that. I'm surprised you newbies lived as long as you did without one. Paimon looked a little miffed at the newbie part, but then smirked. Hey Izuku, she said cheerfully. Can you buy Paimon something from that stand? As Izuku nodded and went over, Paimon leaned in closer to Amber. How's the witch's boyfriend doing? The white-haired girl whispered. Amber's face now resembled a tomato as Paimon smirked. All right. Time for me to take my leave. She squeaked as she turned away and ran straight into Izuku, who had 3 meat sticks. He held one up to Amber and nervously smiled. Would you like one? He stammered as he held up the stick, hoping that this would be able to pay for defending them earlier. Unfortunately, our green-haired protagonist had no idea of the storm that was brewing in the young girl's head. What does he mean by that? Amber thought with growing embarrassment. Is he suggesting that we as a share? L like a C couple? Amber suddenly saw a nearby couple sharing a pasta bowl. Both of their lips were on a single noodle, getting closer and closer and closer. Izuku blinked in confusion as Amber ran the opposite way shrieking, her face as red as the ribbon on top of her head. Huh? He said confusedly. I know she had work to do, but that was a bit rude. He glanced at Paimon. Do you think she's allergic to this certain meat or something? Paimon rolled her eyes at the dense boy. Yeah, Paimon believes that might be it. The white-haired girl agreed. Izuku nodded. All right. Let's go to where Amber is. We should take our time though. She said she was a bit busy. Paimon nodded happily as Izuku gave her a meat stick, which she chewed happily. Together, Izuku and Paimon made their way around the grand town. The third store they had ran into sold clothes, so Paimon went in and bought Izuku a green jacket. Nothing too fancy, a simple green jacket with 2 metal shoulder pads. For any normal human, it would have weighed a ton. But thanks to Izuku's training sessions with All Might, he put them on and only felt a slight shift in weight. He got some weird look, sure, but it was better than them seeing him walk around in an old, dirty UA uniform. As the duo made their way around town, they noticed many people, all of whom were in conversation or yelling at nearby residents to buy their products. Izuku looked at his map as he looked around. They seemed to be getting closer to the spot where Amber said she would meet them. Paimon floated behind Izuku, oblivious to the staring and whispering her floating had attracted. Izuku didn't really care either, as neither of them planned on staying long, unless Izuku got in as a knight. As they slowly made their way up a set of stone stairs, Izuku saw what appeared to be an enormous chapel. It was easiest the biggest building in the village, with people walking in and out. Most of them were in deep conversation, while others were handing out flyers. As Izuku reached the top of the stairs, he saw a massive statue with a ton of people standing in around it. He looked around and saw Amber mumbling to herself, with a strange contraption next to her. As he approached her, he heard her mumbling. Who does Kia think he is? We're equalish. I mean, to give me these reports. Izuku coughed and Amber's head shot up. Oh, I wasn't expecting you guys so soon, Amber commented. She put away the paper and looked out at the majestic view. Izuku followed suit. Anyway, Amber said, reaching into her pocket. If you're thinking about becoming a knight, which, may I add, you have almost no chance of becoming, you'll need this. Amber then tried to reach towards the contraption, but it blew away. Amber frowned as she looked up at the sky, which Izuku had noticed was becoming progressively darker. Paimon looked around in confusion. Did you see anything strange on your way here, Izuku? Amber asked tentatively as she summoned her bow. And not sure. I'm new, so I really don't know about what's normal around here. Izuku snapped his fingers. I saw someone eating a fried frog. Is that weird? Amber sighed. No, that's a delicacy here. What I meant by weird what she meant, Izuku would never find out, as multiple mini tornadoes hit the ground around them. As a huge roar filled the air, Amber suddenly took aim and shot a warning arrow. The flaming arrow disappeared in the clouds. It didn't come back down. But what did come back down was much bigger than a little arrow. An enormous dragon had emerged from out of the clouds, letting out an ear-splitting roar. The townspeople ran for shelter, screeching for their lives. The storm terror, Amber screamed as she loaded another arrow. What the hell's it doing here? We knew it existed, but did T think it would make such a bold an attempt on the town? Paimon squealed in fright as she went to float behind Izuku. But as she went, she noticed Izuku was gone. What the hell? Came the voice of Amber. Is that Izuku? He must have gotten blown up there. Paimon looked up in terror as she saw Izuku at the top of the tornado in the air, right next to the dragon. "Get out of there, you moron," Amber screamed as she took aim once more. Izuku looked around in horror. He was not expecting to be the dragon's first victim. He was getting higher and higher up from the ground, and the dragon was becoming clearer. The shrieks of Paimon and Amber were becoming fainter, as was the screaming of the townspeople. Screaming? Izuku looked down. He saw the tornadoes rip through stores, the unlucky people getting injured. People were running through the streets in panic, screaming for their family, thinking they were going to die. Izuku's eyes regained their steely resolve as they had multiple times before. He looked at the dragon with anger and a bit of fear. The dragon let out a roar and flew at Izuku at high speeds. Izuku growled as he cocked his fist back, one for all charging in his arm. His hat flying off his head, he let out a primal roar. Georgia smash. His fists met the midpoint of the dragon's face as a shockwave went through the air due to the impact. The dragon let out a roar full of pain and rage, blood welling up in one of its eyes. It flailed and roared as it quickly took off in the opposite direction. The mini tornadoes disappeared, and the sky cleared up as Izuku fell from the sky, unconscious, his right arm flapping uselessly in the wind. All of the townspeople's jaws were on the floor when they saw the green-haired boy throw his fist at the dragon and injure it. They all gawked as they saw the dragon fly away. Paimon and Amber's jaws were also on the floor. They had seen Izuku do some incredible stuff, sure, but to injure a dragon, it was unheard of. No human in history could face a dragon and come out alive. Amber blinked as she saw Izuku fall through the clouds at high speeds. As she ran to catch him, she saw that Paimon had already caught Izuku and was surprisingly support his weight fairly well. And then she saw it happen again. It had only happened for a split second, but it had happened nonetheless. A spark from Izuku's broken arm made its way onto the unaware Paimon and merged into her skin. Paimon frowned as she felt a sudden itch on her neck, but ignored it. As she landed, she put the green-haired boy on the ground and began to heal the knocked-out Izuku. The townsfolk suddenly formed a crowd and began to cheer. 3 cheers for our savior. He's the green-haired miracle worker, see? I told you so. He's amazing. I wonder if he's single. Amber blinked as she looked down at the fallen form of Izuku. The boy had limitless power. If he could control it, then he would be a valuable asset of the Knights of Favonius. Suddenly, a thought occurred to the girl. She had to charge her magical energy into her arrows. What if he was like that? Only he charged too much energy into his attacks. If she could teach him how to control his power, to harness it, then he would be a force to be reckoned with. Amber didn't notice a blue-haired male wearing an eye patch made his way into the crowd, and the crows suddenly fell silent. The male walked to the center, where Paimon was still healing Izuku. Paimon looked up at the young man and got into a defensive position. Amber, torn from her thoughts, looked up and let out an audible gasp. Kia. Izuku's head was swimming. He opened his eyes to a dark cave. He blinked before he realized he couldn't breathe. He got up, sputtering, and was surprised that his bones didn't hurt from the smash. Suddenly everything came back to Izuku as worry overcame him. Was everyone all right? Did anyone die? Did he help everyone? He ignored the questions bouncing around in his head as he got to his feet, his bones creaking in protest. With a final groan, he got onto his feet, taking in his surroundings. What had appeared to be a cave was a place which Izuku could not define. The sky was completely black as he was standing in knee-deep water. As Izuku looked around, he saw something of interest. A giant, metallic door stood in the middle of the water, rusted and uninviting. Izuku made his way over to the door and peered around it. It was just a door. Nothing else. He walked behind the door and saw the other end of it. There was no room or anything. Just a door. As he went to the front of the door, pondering about his way out, he heard hushed whispering coming from the door. Cautiously, he pressed his ear against the cold door and listened. The hushed whispering did not get any louder, but it did become clearer. He was only able to make out a few words. One Allen, Bloodwill. Successor. Great O the Were. Suddenly, the words were cut off. A much clearer, louder voice filled the void Izuku was in. Will Izuku wake up soon? Came a small, worried voice. Paimon healed him. So why does Izuku not wake up? Wait, look, he's stirring, came another feminine voice. Come on Izuku, wake up. Izuku suddenly looked around and noticed the void was disappearing. Before he could form another thought, a sudden tiredness overcame him as he collapsed into the water. The last thing he saw was a figure standing above him before his consciousness gave way to dizzying blackness. What the hell do you mean another world? An angry and internally scared Yurikaka asked a pissed-off Bakugo. The blonde-haired boy had walked in and told them what had happened. No one would have believed him if he were someone else. But since the news was coming from a scowling Bakugo, and was confirmed by a tired Aizawa, who left soon after breaking the news in order to get anything else they may have missed out of the man, they had no idea what to do. Wait, came the voice of Mainta, who looked around eagerly. What if we found that guy who can make portals? Remember, at the attack? What if he could alter TH? It still wouldn't work. Came from the quiet Todoroki. Everything made sense now. Izuku was going to fight him. He was going to show the world the power difference between he and the nervous green-haired boy. But he had disappeared. Instead, he was going to fight the boy with anger issues. He still had a few more matches until then, granted. But he knew he wouldn't lose against such feeble opponents with weak quirks. He's a villain, remember. Besides, he wouldn't help us even if we captured him. He's too loyal. Bakugo growled at the worry-filled room. Like they should be worried about stupid Deku. As much as he hated to admit it, the stupid nerd knew how to take care of himself. He knew that the green-haired boy could take care of himself perfectly fine. Mainly because he had in all of grade school. All alone. Shinso stood out in the hall. He slowly began making his way to the seating area, his hands tightening into fists. Izuku was going to win, he was sure of it. And then, the green-haired boy just so happened to come across a man who transported him into another world. As though some divine force wanted Izuku to lose. Suddenly Shinso blinked. Aizawa had indeed told him about how the man wanted to come and see Shinso, to possibly recruit him, and how the man's quirk worked. What if, by some chance, the man had put the globe there, in a hope that the boy who defeated the boy he was going to recruit would vanish? It didn't quite add up though, as there were multiple holes in this hypothesis. But it made some sense. Shinso made a sudden turn at a corridor, into another hallway. He would find out what happened to the green-haired boy. He would find out what happened to his first friend. Izuku's eyes fluttered open as he stared up at a ceiling. His whole body hurt, as though someone had dared him to fight the pro-heroes Eraserhead and Midnight at the same time. His head hurt too, as though someone had been violently shaking him. There was a sudden gasp and a cry. Izuku is awake. He suddenly got all of the air knocked out of him, as a little white ball accidentally head-butt him right in his stomach. His face contorted to one full of pain as his back hit the wall. He heard laughter as he slowly got up and stared down at the little ball. Paimon had latched herself onto him, her head in his shirt. She looked up, tears in her eyes. "Thank the gods," Paimon exclaimed. I healed Izuku. But Izuku didn't wake up. Paimon was so worried. As Paimon hugged Izuku, Izuku began to take in his surroundings. He was in a very spacious room that had elegant furniture. As he looked around, he noticed voices were coming from the other room. Before he could question Paimon, he heard another voice. "Comfortable," came a smug voice. "I wouldn't be if that thing sobbed into my clothes." Izuku looked over to the couch, where he noticed Amber sitting. She had changed clothes, no longer wearing her jumper-like outfit or ribbon. Instead, she was wearing what Izuku could classify as pajamas. She wore a smug smile, but her eyes held a hint of worry in them. Paimon scowled. Paimon did not ask the witch what she thought. Amber snarled. "I am not a witch," she yelled at the triumphant Paimon, who knew she had touched a nerve. Amber suddenly looked at Izuku with a hint of respect and fear. "But everyone in the village saw what you did. You're already going to be in books for being the first person in a long while who was able to actually injure a dragon." Amber took a deep breath. Izuku twitched a little, thinking about what she was going to ask him. About his quirk. He couldn't tell them. He promised All Might he wouldn't tell anyone. True, he had broken it telling Kaken. But he didn't even believe him. Izuku had expected for Amber to sit in front of him and to start interrogating him. It would be the rational thing to do. He, however, got a reaction from the girl he did not expect. The girl was in front of Izuku in a second, her smug persona gone, as if it were never there. A huge grin had appeared on her face as she looked at him with star-struck eyes. "That was incredible," she whooped. Izuku was taken aback. He was not expecting this kind of reaction from the girl. "How did you do that?" she continued, oblivious to Paimon's snickering at her breaking of character. "Can you teach me how to do that?" Izuku suddenly stiffened at that last part, thinking about how he broke his body whenever he used it. He thought of a broken Amber on the ground and wanted to say no. It was his ability after all. Amber continued her rant. "After all, I noticed that you can't control your power. My arrows are the same. I charge a specific amount of energy into it. So maybe you should try the same. This caught the green-haired boy's undivided attention. He knew the magic she was talking about was very different than one for all. But the basic idea was probably alike, if not the same. It would be very beneficial to learn how to control his powers, especially when fighting a lower-ranked monster. Amber, said a new, calm voice. A masculine one which Izuku did not realize. Don't scare our guest now. Amber stiffened a bit as she turned around. Standing in one of the doorways was a blue-haired man with tan skin and blue lilac eyes. His blue hair came down on one side in the form of a ponytail. He wore an eye patch and had bangs covering a part of his face. Unlike what Amber was currently wearing, the man wore a white fur cloak over a white jacket that exposed his chest to some extent. Alongside that, he wore a navy shirt and pants with fingerless gloves and high boots. He had an aura that emitted confidence as he wore a serious, but kind, smile. Well, sorry Kia. Amber said, not meeting Kia's eyes. I was just telling this newbie how he is not part of the Knights of Favonius, Amber. The man named Kia had stated. Therefore, you are not to help him. He could be an enemy for all we know. He wore a smirk as he then walked next to Amber, whose hands were tightening slightly. Izuku noticed this and leaned back in his chair a bit. He's not. Amber said, quite loudly at that. Izuku and Paimon looked at her in surprise. Amber had been telling them on the way there how she admired Kia and how he ran things. But now, things looked quite different. Amber seemed to be getting angrier the closer Kia got to her. He saved my life. He's not an enemy. Sorry, Amber, he said as he rubbed her shoulders, unaware of her getting up and facing him. Maybe you can convince me, What happened next was so quick, Izuku was almost scared. Amber's fist was where Kia's face had been, but Kia was gone. Izuku looked over at the wall and grimaced. Kia had gotten punched by Amber and had face planted into the wall. Enough with that already, she roared, scaring the green-haired boy to no end. Your stupid charming persona may work on some people, but not on me, she hissed. Kia grunted and chuckled as he pulled himself out of the wall and limped his way over to the couch where Amber had once sat. He plopped himself down and looked over at the bewildered Izuku and Paimon with interest, as though nothing had happened. So, he began, shifting a little bit on the couch, clearly trying to hide some of the pain he was feeling. Amber told me while you were unconscious that you wanted to be a knight. Not only will you take the test, but you need to gain our trust as well. Unless, of course, you changed your mind, he asked, raising an eyebrow. Izuku shook his head. And no. I still want to be a knight and try and help people. Kaya nodded. A very admirable spirit. Thankfully, gaining a reputation won't be very hard for you, miracle worker. Not only that, but your reputation increased even more after you hurt that dragon. We'll do it tomorrow. I know it's rushed, but I'm a busy man. Is that all right with you? Izuku nodded determinedly. Good. Kia then looked at Paimon. I assume you want to help him. If you're an assistant, then you just need to take a written test. Is that okay? The moment the word written was uttered, Paimon looked as though she had seen a dead body. She was pale and shaking a bit. She was terrible at writing, but there was no way she was going to leave Izuku on his own. She still owed him. He believed in her and her dream, so she would do what it took. Paimon will do it, Paimon said, shaking her head frantically. Very well, Kia said, nodding his head with a kind smile. I think it's best if we go to bed. You can stay up later if you want to, considering you just woke up. But I didn't get your name. Oh, Izuku stammered. It's Izuku, sir. Nice to meet you. Izuku. Kia nodded. My name is Kia. If you succeed at your test, then it will be a pleasure to work alongside you. Kia then smiled slyly. Amber, if you could kindly follow me. Lisa and I would like to have a word with you about tomorrow's test. Amber was confused. Why was he smiling like that? She followed his gaze and almost gave an audible gasp. She had somehow made her way next to Izuku and was sitting right next to him. She turned as red as a tomato before she ran out of the room, saying something indecipherable. Sure thing Yona Miha good night Izuku snowflake. She ran out of the room so quickly Izuku almost thought she disappeared. Kia chuckled while shaking his head slightly. Just a warning, Kia continued. Don't let Lisa toy with you. If she gets under your skin, let me know. She's an odd one, to some extent. But she is a very powerful mage. Kia stretched before he got up off the couch, groaning slightly and wincing from getting thrown into the wall. See you tomorrow, Izuku. Get some rest, and something solid to eat. I recommend the fried frog. It's quite good. And with that, he strode out of the room. Paimon was sweating as she floated over next to Izuku, who was muttering to himself. What questions do you think they'll ask Paimon? The history of this place. Paimon doesn't know anything about this place. Paimon is bad at Remy. Izuku had tuned Paimon out as he pondered what the test would be. It had to be somewhat hard, considering there were so few knights. He had also mentioned someone named Lisa. I need to keep my guard up. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, so I should be careful and ready, Izuku muttered to himself. Izuku then noticed Paimon floating around him, who was progressively getting more worried by the second. He didn't blame her. Back in her village, they probably didn't have much writing experience as other places. Izuku sighed to himself. He would have to spend the night teaching Paimon how to write. Great. Izuku got up off the couch. See, come on. I saw a place that has good food that's always open. Let's go eat there. I'll teach you some writing tricks while we eat. Izuku got near the door, ready to leave, when he noticed Paimon was next to him. He looked back and Paimon was smiling at him, her eyes watery. Thank you, Izuku. Paimon will forever be in your debt, she cried as she jumped on his face and hugged him. She hugged the poor boy for a few minutes, until she realized he was beginning to asphyxiate. She quickly got off him and apologized. They then made their way outside. Paimon then floated towards the cafe singing, while Izuku was regaining oxygen. Meat, 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 wonderful meat, Paimon sang. Beef or pork, chicken in the deli. It doesn't matter, it'll end up in my belly. Izuku sighed as he took a deep breath. He wondered what everyone else was doing, if they were looking for him. He then thought of Todoroki, and his heart dropped. He wanted to tell Todoroki that his quirks was his, and not his father's. But he couldn't now. Maybe, when he got brought back. Izuku's stomach lurched. He forgot. If he got brought back, then he would never see Paimon or Amber again. Maybe he could bring them with him. There was probably no chance, but maybe. Izuku, came an excited voice, breaking Izuku away from his thoughts. Wrong way. The food place is this way. Izuku ran his hand through his hair and nodded as he followed Paimon, while wearing one of the hats given to him. Mom, he whispered as Paimon accidentally ran head first into a sign, and then bounced back up as though nothing had happened. I love you. Stay safe, all right? Tears cascaded down his cheek. Paimon noticed this and grabbed Izuku's hand. Izuku looked down at the smiling Paimon. Izuku can choose the meat if it helps him feel better, Paimon said with a smile. She didn't know why Izuku was crying. She had never seen him do it before. But she knew that Izuku was there for her, so she would be there for him. Izuku smiled and wiped his eyes. Damn, haven't cried in a while, not since the fest. Izuku stopped mid-sentence as Paimon looked at him curiously. He hadn't told anyone yet that he was from another world or time. Or place. Izuku didn't know. But no one here knew about Japan. What did Izuku say? Asked Paimon curiously, prodding his bicep. I said feast. I said feast. There was so much food at a feast I once went to, I cried. Izuku quickly made up. Paimon's mouth watered as she looked at him with starry eyes. Feast? Was it good? How much food was there? Lucky Izuku. Paimon wishes she was there. The white-haired girl exclaimed. Izuku grabbed Paimon's hand. I'll tell you about it later. Let's go to the cafe. Paimon nodded frantically as she and Izuku made their way down the street, the lights in the stores illuminating their path in the night. By any chance, if Izuku couldn't go back, things here wouldn't be so bad after all. Izuku opened his eyes and was welcomed to the sight of storm clouds through the window of the room he was resting in. Paimon was on the couch near the blue-sheeted bed that Izuku had slept in. She let out a light snore before turning over on her side, so Izuku couldn't see her face anymore. The green-haired boy looked out the window and thought about the previous day. About the warning Kia had given him about Lisa, how if he passed, he would become a knight, and how Amber had supported him. He then remembered teaching Paimon how to write. The white-haired girl's performance at writing at first had been abysmal. However, after about 3 hours of trial and error, she had finally shown improvement. He was proud of her, unbelievably so. Izuku then got up quietly, not wanting to wake up the girl, and got himself dressed. As he entered the bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror, he noticed something he had not noticed before. He had no stubble or facial hair of any kind at that. In fact, minus his clothes, He looked exactly how he looked when he had arrived. Not a single hair on his head had grown out. While Izuku observed this discovery, he suddenly heard footsteps and humming. Someone had walked into the bathroom without noticing him. The lights suddenly turned out as Izuku looked over. He saw Kiya in bright blue sleepwear by the door. He yawned as he walked over to Izuku. "So, are you nervous for today?" he began, as though he and Izuku were discussing over breakfast, rather than in a bathroom. Izuku snapped out of his stupor before nodding. He was quite nervous for today. After all, he had only been in this world for a short time, and he already had a good reputation so far. "I'm a bit nervous," Izuku admitted as Kiya glanced at him with a look akin to interest. "Is this Lisa person as bad as you make her out to be?" Before Kiya could respond, there was a knocking at the door. Kiya sighed as he walked over to the bathroom door, grumbling to himself. "Why is she here now? It's only 7 in the morning, damn it." Kiya turned around and sighed. "Well, I gotta go answer that. It's probably Lisa. She's a nice person, even if she is rather well." The knocking became much louder as Kiya's eye twitched. As he turned around, he looked over his shoulder at Izuku. "Another thing for becoming a knight is that you cannot hold secrets," Kiya said seriously, ignoring the knocking, which was getting progressively louder by the second. "You will have to tell us your power and origin. Otherwise, you cannot join. The same goes for that little friend of yours. Understand?" Izuku nodded, determined not to show Kiya the panic that was now flowing through him. His power's origins were uncomfortable enough, but origin? He couldn't. They would kick him out due to thinking he was insane. How would he even break this to them? "Hey guys, guess what? You know how I'm that weird guy who lived in the forest? Well, it turns out I'm actually not from this world. Crazy, right?" Even in Izuku's head, the statement sounded unbelievably stupid. Izuku heard the door open as he heard 2 voices talking. He was about to go out when the bathroom door opened. A tired Amber walked into the room, her hair sticking up in random places, wearing nothing but a towel. She wandered over to the sink with glazed eyes, oblivious to Izuku, who had just stepped back to make room for her. The brown-haired girl then leaned down as she splashed her face with cold water. She shivered a bit before coming back up. She then turned around to grab a brush from the cabinet. The cabinet Izuku was standing in front of. Amber muttered a tired "move." Izuku complied as he moved out of the way. Amber then opened the cabinet and grabbed her black brush. She then made her way over to the mirror with her brush in her hand. She stared at the mirror for a few seconds before turning around. Izuku smiled nervously as he gave her a half-hearted wave. Amber blinked. Once, twice, 3 times. The young girl's scream was heard throughout the whole of Mondstadt. Izuku made his way over to the couch, wincing due to the pain coming from his stomach where Amber had hit him. He then sat down next to a chipper Paimon, who had been woken up due to the loud scream. Across from them sat a content Kiya and a blushing, embarrassed Amber, who was looking everywhere and anywhere but Izuku. Kiya nodded. "All right, Lisa is waiting outside in the training yard. I'm going to be overviewing your exam, so I do hope you impress me." Kiya got up as he then looked at Paimon. "You will be taking your written exam after Izuku. I would usually have someone to overview it, but the person who was originally intended to examine you has a rather biased opinion." He looked over at Amber, who was scowling, despite her blush, at the happy white-haired girl. Paimon just grinned devilishly at her. She had been told by a flustered Izuku what had happened only after pouting for 15 minutes for him to tell her what happened, due to his red face. After she had received this bit of information, she had donned an evil smirk. Izuku, who knew Paimon very well, knew that she would most likely use this as teasing material later. Paimon then gave a toothy smile at Kiya. "It's okay. Paimon will wait until Izuku is done." Kiya nodded again. "Good. Well then, let's get going." He suddenly sprang up from his seat and got on one knee in front of Amber. "Now, do you need help up by any chance, Tilda?" Izuku had gotten up from his seat, with a happy Paimon floating around him. As he stood fully up, he looked over to the Kiya-shaped hole in the wall. He then glanced at the growling Amber, who met his gaze for the first time that morning. She then turned away blushing as Paimon snorted. Amber snarled at her before she quickly ran out of the room before Izuku could say anything. "All right," Izuku grinned, despite still being a bit flustered from his encounter with Amber. "Let's show these knights what we're made of, Paimon." Paimon nodded determinedly. She would do him proud. Izuku made his way over to the door that led to the training yard. This was it. He was nervous, but excited. He would be able to be a hero in this world, just like in his own. Izuku couldn't help but frown a bit as he stared at the door leading to the training yard. He thought of All Might, and how much he had sacrificed for the green-haired boy. But all of that had been for nothing if he couldn't get back home. He suddenly felt a tug on his sleeve. He looked over his shoulder to see a slightly twitching Paimon. She gave him a nervous smile and nodded. He suddenly regained the steely, determined look that he donned whenever someone was in trouble. He gripped the doorknob tightly. This was it. And then, he opened the door. Todoroki scowled as he dodged another attack from Shiro, who was unrelenting with his attacks. This was unfair. He was supposed to be getting ready to fight Izuku, not this. Tape man. The green-haired boy had made a proclamation against him. He was supposed to prove Izuku wrong. How he was stronger than him. How he didn't understand his pain. How much more he had trained in order to surpass him. To surpass everyone. But now, instead of fighting Izuku, he was fighting a black-haired nobody. What was his name again? Shiro. Shiro gave Todoroki a wide grin as he punched him in the chest, sending the dual-haired boy back a few feet. Don't worry, Todoroki, Shiro said as he leapt at him, tape shooting out of his elbows. This'll be over in a flash. Todoroki's mind began to wander. Flash, flash, flash. A young Todoroki sat up in a room, covered head to toe in cuts and bruises. An unimpressed Endeavor stood before him. That is not how you use your fire, Endeavor shouted. Like this. Flame flash. A burst of fire erupted from his father's hands, burning the door and the side of the young boy's cheek. Tears rolled down the boy's face. But daddy, the little Todoroki cried. I want to see Mommy Aga. He was interrupted by his father slapping him in the face. Quit your whining, Endeavor shouted once more. She isn't here because she ruined my creation. She served her purpose. Her purpose. Todoroki stood with his hair shadowing his eyes in the middle of the ring, Shiro's victorious laughter morphing into his father's cruel laughter. A few flames danced around Todoroki's hand before he clenched his hand tightly, gritting his teeth. Shiro, however, did not see these red flags. As he put more tape around the ring, laughing victorious. It's over, Todoroki. The black-haired boy laughed, unaware of the ice forming in Todoroki's hand. She's useless to me. Useless. Todoroki raised his head, his eyes tracing the crowd. You should be glad she's gone. Glad? Todoroki's eyes finally focused on one man in the crowd, a pro-hero with a flaming beard, who stared down at him with an impassive look. You are my weapon. I will use you to surpass All Might. Your weapon. It was right then and there. Something in Todoroki snapped. He didn't move. Time seemed to slow down. Suddenly, everything seemed insignificant. All Might, the US students, the laughing Shiro, the worried crowd. Time seemed to freeze as Todoroki looked at Endeavor. His parent. His father. His reason for not having a mom around anymore. The dual-haired boy looked up at the man with contempt and hatred. I honestly hate you. The boy hissed under his breath as he raised his arm. And then, all at once, time returned to normal. It had happened in an instant. All Might gave a gasp of surprise as Aizawa and the portal man looked on in shock from their booth. People in the crowd had blinked, and it was there. The crowd gave a shriek of terror, pressing themselves backwards onto the back of their seats. The UA students looked on in awe and shock. They had not expected for Todoroki to be this far ahead of them. A massive pillar of ice had appeared in the middle of the ring, so wide that it took up the whole ring, and was so tall that it creaked threateningly above the audience. Shiro was covered from neck to toe in ice. He was shivering and his body and tape were complete encased in ice. Midnight was shivering too. Half of her body was completely encased as well. See, can you move, Shiro? Asked the pro-hero as she broke out of the ice. Why you serious? The black-haired boy asked through chattering teeth. I see couldn't move even if I used all my T-tape to get myself free. He kinda sounds like Deku with all that stuttering. Bakugo thought. Even with the somewhat comedic comment, Bakugo did not crack a smile. A scowl graced his features as he stared at the dual-haired boy standing in the middle of the ring. Todoroki, looking slightly apologetic, quickly destroyed the ice as Shiro fell to the ground, shaking like a leaf. As Todoroki went over to help the black-haired boy up, Bakugo looked furious. The blonde knew that the winner had been holding back quite a lot. Bakugo snarled as he saw Todoroki whisper something to Shiro, who smiled a bit shakingly and nodded understandingly. They then both gripped each other's hands and shook for the world to see. The crowd was now clapping out of pity for Shiro and respect for the sportsmanship that both Todoroki and Shiro were showing. As Shiro went back into the tunnel, people were waving at him, shouting things such as, "Nice try. Get 'em next time. There's always next year. And, you did incredible to come as far as you did." Todoroki couldn't help but feel a little pity staring at the retreating form of the boy as he turned to glare up at his father. He quickly walked out of the ring, not anticipating the match he would soon have with the explosive boy. What a cutie. Izuku suddenly felt 2 hands on his back and was forced into a hug. He heard Kia chuckle as he heard a gasp from Amber. Paimon floated around the 2 individuals, unsure what to do. When Izuku was released from this hug, Paimon quickly flew over to him. "Is Izuku okay?" asked Paimon worriedly. "Did the woman do something to Izuku?" "Oh no," Izuku said, still a bit red from the contact. The woman giggled as he looked at her for the first time. The woman had curly dark brown hair with green eyes and a rather curvy build with fair skin. She wore a white and purple dress that was open on the sides that was embroidered in gold. With that, she wore black gloves, a large witch's hat, along with black lace stockings. Her hair appeared to be tied back with a tiny purple rose. The woman looked at Izuku, a smile gracing her full lips. "You sure know how to pick 'em, Kia. He sure looks like a lot of fun, Tilda." It only took a matter of seconds for Izuku to realize that this woman and the pro hero Midnight would be best of friends. The woman winked at Izuku as Izuku flushed. Kia chuckled. "Well then," he spoke up. "I think it's best if we begin. Don't you agree, Amber?" "Amber." He turned around, confused, noticing Amber's silence. He looked around, only to see Amber standing right next to the doorway staring at Lisa and Izuku. If looks could kill, they would have both dropped dead in a second. Minus this ferocious look, her face was quite red. Kia turned around and laughed. "Awa," he teased, "is the great outrider of the Knights of Favonius G." He was cut off as a fist made his face. He flew into the wall, breaking through it and the wall behind it. Amber resembled a tomato once more as she made a weird noise between a snarl and a whimper as she leaned against a wall, still glaring at Lisa, who was now laughing at her, while Paimon was still checking Izuku frantically in case Lisa had done anything to him. Izuku was trying his hardest to keep a deadpan expression to crawl onto his face. "These guys defend the city, they're nuts," the young boy thought to himself as he patted Paimon's head as the little girl let out a sigh of relief. "Paimon don't trust that woman Izuku," Paimon said, looking at Lisa, who was now teasing a red, yelling Amber. "The strange woman looks like a witch. Paimon doesn't like witches." Izuku sighed as he whispered words of encouragement into Paimon's ear. She looked more content after he was done whispering, and puffed out her chest determinedly as she and the green-haired boy turned to face the trio. Lisa bowed. "My name is Lisa. I am a Knight of Favonius. You must be Izuku." She grinned right there, making the boy nervous. She waved him off, laughing at his attitude. "With that aside, Amber has informed us that you and the girl want to come knights. Well, it won't be easy at all. But who knows? Miracles happen. You might get in." She turned around, pulling out a spellbook. Amber and Kia immediately stepped back, with Kia grabbing a bewildered Paimon away from Izuku. "Now," the witch said, opening up the book, charging her hand with power. "We'll see if you can pass the first test." A sadistic smile appeared on her face. "With that out of the way, let's begin." Aizawa had his eyes on the arena, while Toshinori was forcing more answers out of the man in another room. Aizawa didn't want to admit it, but he was in deep sh*t. He had lost one of his students to a completely random stranger. The boy's family would have his head on a pike. After all, it was Aizawa's responsibility to watch after his students, not to mention it was one of the only parts to his job. Aizawa heard the door slam as he turned around to see All Might walked into the room. The blonde skinny man sat down on a chair near the window when he had walked in and rubbed his temples. "Anything new?" he asked as he turned back around to watch Bakugo fight Tokoyami, who was using Dark Shadow to try and push back the explosive boy. All Might sighed. "We have some information, but not nearly enough to find out where young Midoriya went. This guy may be leaving certain things out. The police are grilling him as we speak." An uncomfortable silence filled the room as they watched the match. Toshinori wasn't feeling much better than Aizawa. He was young Midoriya's mentor, his idol, his teacher for crying out loud. And despite having done so much for his student, he felt like he failed him. He had no idea where he was. He hoped that the boy was taking care of himself, and that he was using his quirk to help others like he had done before. There is one thing I forgot to mention. All Might brought up. Aizawa turned to look the unnaturally skinny man in the eye. Young Izuku will not age much in whatever world he may be in. When the police grilled him, he said that the world young Midoriya is in runs on a different clock. They said that he might have been in there for a week at his end, while he's only been gone for a few hours on our end. All Might stopped and grit his teeth. He felt a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time, helplessness. Like how he had felt when he watched other heroes threw their lives down to make other lives better. Just how his mentor had done for him. Don't beat yourself up over it, Aizawa said as his gaze made its way back to the retreating Takoyami. He knows how to take care of himself. He's not defenseless. Small comfort, the blonde-haired man snarled. The boy does not know how to use that quirk well. He could kill himself if he used it. Not to mention that world he's in is a mystery. He could be getting poisoned, electrified, burned. Aizawa chuckled. Really, Toshinori? I bet he's fine. To be fair, what are the odds he's being electrified right now? She can use electricity. The green-haired boy was thinking this as he dodged another bolt heading his way. They had been going for only 1 minute and Izuku already hated it. One false move, and he was toast. Literally. Come on, cutie, screamed the semi-sadistic voice of a woman who had apparently lost her mind. It doesn't hurt that much. Most people don't even have time to scream when it hits them, so no worries. This is bad, Izuku thought to himself as he dodged another bolt by an inch, causing it to hit the wall and blow it into pieces. That's better. Lisa giggled crazily, causing Paimon to tense, getting ready to jump on Izuku to heal him. Amber looked somewhat uncomfortable at Lisa's antics, while Kia kept a straight face. Is this really necessary, Kia? Amber asked, her golden eyes narrowing as Izuku dodged another blast by an inch, followed by an insane laugh from Lisa. I mean, not that I want that Neanderthal tarnishing our image, but I didn't fight Lisa until my last test. Why are we doing it first? Kia sighed and looked around. Paimon was too focused on the fight to hear anything else, and Izuku and Lisa wouldn't be able to hear them. He leaned over to Amber, who eyed him suspiciously. Look, he began in a serious, low tone. This is going to be the only test that Izuku will have to do. Amber blinked before her eyes narrowed even further. Wise th. We have, business to attend to. Something that's going to need more than 3 people. The business will be Izuku's test. As for his companion, he quickly spared a glance at Paimon, who was now nervously gnashing her teeth, watching a bolt miss Izuku's head. If she stays by him the whole time and helps him during this mission, then I will allow her to join with him. Amber blinked at him before focusing back on the fight. It was unlike Kia to be so serious and vague. The mission must be important. After leaping in the air to avoid another attack, Izuku quickly spun around on his heel. Lisa had a crazed smile on her face as she aimed her finger at him, which was charged with power. Izuku trembled ever so slightly before he sighed and brought his finger into an aimed flick. I'll use the move I used against Amber. That should end it. Izuku took a deep breath and screamed at the heavens. Delaware smash. He unleashed the flick, which tore through the air towards the shocked woman. The boy had gone from dodging to an attack like this. How much power did he have? Lisa decided to ask those questions later, as the flick hit her dead on, exploding when it hit her. However, the attack did not end there. It went through the wall behind Lisa, and then the wall behind that. The simple flick tore up pavement and destroyed trees. Izuku panted as he felt some of his energy leave him. His finger was now a shade of purple and was broken. He looked over at the clearing smoke, careful not to underestimate his enemy. Paimon had a smirk on her face, while Amber and Kia looked on with no expression. Izuku had won. There was no way th. The smoke cleared, and a slightly ruffled up Lisa was standing there, having blocked it with a spell. She looked at her slightly ripped clothes and her smile because wider. Yes, she shouted, raising her arms wide. Don't hold anything back, because your test is ending now. She pulled out her book and raised her hands. Violet electricity formed in her hands as the book flew into the air above her. No matter what she did, Izuku knew that he would probably get defeated if he took her attack head-on. He looked around. There had to be something that could help him. Anything. She then clapped her hands together and took aim at Izuku while smiling. Now, this might hurt a little, cutie. But don't worry. You can try the test again in another year. Heaven light beam. A truly magnificent blast of lightning left her hands. Izuku looked on at the approaching blast terrified. He had to do something. He had to win. Think. Think. The blast met Izuku, and a huge explosion followed. Smoke and debris flew in different directions as Lisa's lips twisted in a victorious smile. Paimon looked on, horrified that the one who saved her life was now toast. Kiya shook his head, while Amber turned to Paimon, smirking on the outside, but feeling a bit sickened on the inside. See? Amber scoffed at Paimon, trying to not get her worry over the boy in her voice. Paymon's gaze was still on the place where Izuku had been. I told you it would end like this, but did you listen? No. Amber smiled. She had proven the white-haired girl wrong. While that gave her some sense of victory, she tried to push down the sympathy she felt for Izuku. He had a ton of power. If only he knew how to use it without breaking himself, maybe he could have won. Amber suddenly turned to Paimon. Snowflake, you knew this was coming, but I'll say it anyway. I told you as. Suddenly, a huge piece of rock flew out of the smoke and smashed against the unaware Lisa, who tumbled into a wall. Paymon's breathing stopped for a minute along with Amber, who was still in a victorious pose, her face frozen. It couldn't be. It couldn't be. A heavily exhausted Izuku stood there with a smile, holding his hand. Paimon noticed how he didn't look that bad for taking on a huge attack. But as she analyzed him, she noticed that he now had 2 broken fingers. Strange, he only had one before. Lisa stood up, shaking slightly, looking livid and confused. Her clothes were now significantly ripped and covered in scratches, and her hat was gone. Blood ran down her face, and she was missing a tooth. All from one throw. Lisa moved slightly, wincing at the pain shooting through her back where she had landed. She was angry, confused, and incredulous. How had he done it? It was impossible. He couldn't have taken the attack from point-blank range. He would be fried if he had. So how was it possible? Kiya now had a huge grin on his face while staring out at the contestants. Amber's mouth was nearly touching the floor, shocked at the sudden comeback. Paimon had tears in her eyes. He wouldn't let her down, she knew it. Izuku chuckled, flinching at the pain flowing through his hand. He looked up at the woman, who gazed at him disbelievingly. Why, you're probably wondering how this is happening. Izuku said, who, despite slightly shaking, was wearing a smile. I'll tell you how. When you used your lightning, I saw a flaw. Lisa now looked at him as though he had grown a second head. A flaw? This can't be. How? When? Izuku was now charging up a fist of one for all behind his back. He could end this if he kept her talking. When you fired the blast, I knew there would be some kickback. So right when it was about to hit me, I used my ability and broke the rock beneath me, and the backlash sent me into the air. That helped me dodge, all while kicking up enough dust to make anyone think that I had been hurt badly. Since debris went flying everywhere, I was able to grab a piece. And, well, he gestured to her slightly broken form. He smirked at her odd gaze while he raised his hand. Looks like it worked. Now, Lisa, you said my test was ending. I couldn't agree more. Before she could dodge or move at that, he roared out once more. Delaware smash. This time, the woman could not deflect or block from the attack. She only watched helplessly as it came closer, closer, and closer. She closed her eyes, bracing herself from the pain that was coming. She had tried, she really had. But the boy had bested her. And this was her punishment for dropping her guard. Silence. Strange, shouldn't the attack have hit her by now? She cracked open an eye, only to see the world horizontally. She had been knocked over. She had been saved. She looked around for her savior, and she saw him. Izuku Midoriya was gritting his teeth, stopping himself from screaming. He had knocked the woman out of the way, but had broken his leg in the process. His other leg, while not broken, was not exactly painless either. Lisa looked at him, shocked. She had deserved to take the attack head-on. She truly deserved it for being overconfident. She had underestimated the boy, not thinking he had what it took to become a knight. How wrong she had been. Her lower lip trembled slightly as she turned over so he couldn't see her. Why? She whispered, so that only he could hear her. Why? If my attack hit you, there was a chance you could have not recovered. So why go out of your way to help me? Izuku looked over at the woman's slightly shaking form. He smiled, and said something he had said not a very long time. Well, it looked like you were asking for help. Lisa's eyes widened as she suddenly came back to a forgotten memory of hers. A young, 4-year-old Lisa ran through the long grass of a forest surrounding Mondstadt. She was running as fast as she could. She couldn't let them catch her. She couldn't. Why hadn't she listened to her parents? They told her not to go outside the walls. But here she was, being chased by a monster because she had been exploring. A sudden root caught her by the foot. She desperately pulled, but to no avail. She looked on in terror as an enormous hand reached down to grab her, the rest of the monster enveloped in shadow. This was it. This was the end. The little Lisa let out a scream. "Someone help me," she screeched as they closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable. There was a sudden roar of anger, a sound of surprise, a shriek, a gargling noise, and then silence. The little Lisa opened her eyes to the silhouette of an adult. "Hey kid, are you all right?" The man tilted his head ever so slightly. The little Lisa looked over at the corpse of the monster in pure shock. This man had killed it? She then noticed a sword slung over his shoulder, and how it was completely covered in blood. The man himself, however, was unscathed. "Come on, kid." The man laughed, lightly grabbing her shoulder. "Let's get you home. Your parents must be worried sick." The tiny girl looked back at the dead monster, slightly revolted. This man had taken a life away and felt nothing. True, it wasn't a human, but maybe it was going to leave her alone if she ran far enough away. When she had asked the man this, the man laughed harder. "A monster leaving you alone after chasing you for a good mile. Good luck with that." The girl stared down at her purple dress. So then she asked the man a simple question. Why? Why did he save her? The man raised an eyebrow at her question. "What are you, kid? Suicidal? Were you hoping the monster would kill you?" The girl feverishly shook her head. She didn't need a stranger to lecture her. "Well," the strange man said, looking out at the dead monster. "'Cause you were asking for help, stupid. What else?" The young Lisa puffed out her cheek in annoyance. "I am not stupid," she replied hotly. The man scoffed at her. "Sure you aren't, kid. That's what all the stupid people say. Anyway, come on, I'll get you home." He began to walk away, as a young Lisa scuffled after him, not eager to see what her parents had to say. "'Cause you were asking for help, stupid. What else?" Well, it looked like you were asking for help." Tears made their way out of the woman's eyes as she looked over at green-haired boy, who was cursing under his breath as Paimon, when did she come, was healing him, giving him words of encouragement. The boy had helped her just as the man had done. Unlike the man, he didn't even have to take a life to do so. Izuku looked over at Paimon, and then back at the woman. "Paimon, can you heal her tooth and everything, please?" he asked. As Paimon nodded, the witch looked over at Izuku, tears still in her eyes, and embraced him in a light hug. Thank you so much, see cutie," she sniffled. Izuku was turning slowly red as Paimon healed Lisa. He smiled and nodded as a once again healthy Lisa. He, however, hadn't noticed a seething Amber, who was glaring at the group. Amber felt a muscle twitch in her cheek. She had been proven wrong by that little snowball. The boy had made it in. Not that he knew, considering he thought that he still had 3 more tests to take. Why was this outsider being allowed into the Knights? And why did a little part of her find that okay? She shook her head rapidly, ignoring the sly glance Kia sent her, due to her reddening face. She did not find it okay. She needed more information on the boy. A moving traveler with that much power. As if. And then there was that snowball. She didn't look like any other villager or being she had ever seen. Where could they have come from? "I hate to intrude," came the voice of Kia. The eye patch-wearing man had a serious look on his face, causing Lisa to wipe her tears and immediately stood up. Izuku then also got on his feet along with Paimon, who was now floating around the green-haired boy's head, sending a gloating look over at Amber. Amber, swallowing her anger, ignored this look. It looked at Kia. "I'm afraid to say that the next part of the test will be a bit more deadly." In the middle of a well-furnished room, a blonde woman was pacing back and forth, her heels clacking as she walked back and forth, lost in thought. There had been multiple storm terror sightings around Mondstadt. The storm terror had also been inside the city at one point. It had somehow got scared away, but she would be a fool to believe that it would not try to attack again. She had so many preparations to make, papers to fill out, and the little fact that there was corruption involving money spreading across the city was not making her job any easier. The woman looked up at the clock, which read 2:30. She had called them hours ago. What could be so important to ignore her call? Before she could summon a knight to send another message, the door creaked open. She looked over to see a slightly grim-faced Kia, a serious Amber, a slightly ruffled-up Lisa, and a strange green-haired boy with a little white-haired girl. She didn't know who these two were, but considering that 3 of her most loyal knights had brought them, she would question them later. Jean, I've brought them, Kia said earnestly. The green-haired boy's name is Izuku, and the girl's name is Paimon. They're both knights in training. Izuku looked at the woman whose name has just been revealed. The woman had a tall, athletic build with short gold blonde hair tied back into a ponytail. Her gray-blue eyes were narrowed as she gazed at the lot of them. She wore a white, blue, black, and red strapless shirt with gold symbols and linings with a blue tailcoat attached to it. Alongside that, she wore white tights embroidered with gold diamond dot patterns, with a pair of snow-white high-heeled boots. The woman adjusted her blue gauntlets as she addressed Kia with two simple words. What happened? Ladies and gentlemen, the fight that you have all been anticipating. A snarking Bakugo and a stone-faced Todoroki walked onto the battlefield. Bakugo growled as Todoroki looked on at him with slight boredom. How dare that bastard? Did he know who he was messing with? He was the strongest person in the whole stadium. A little bit of ice wouldn't stop him from kicking that dual-haired bastard's ass. Meanwhile, Todoroki couldn't help but feel slight disappointment. He had wanted to fight Izuku. While he acknowledged Bakugo for his strength, he wanted to see what Izuku would have said after he had frozen him solid. He would have proven his bastard of a father wrong. In the stands, Ilda looked on in mild concern for his classmates. Who do you think will emerge victorious, Uraraka? Uraraka looked on in interest. After worrying about Deku for hours, she had finally been comforted by All Might and Aizawa that the boy would most likely return soon. While she did not like the most likely part, she was glad that there was a chance she would see the boy again soon. She missed her friend a lot. Yup, her really close friend. Uraraka had gained a blush on her face that had gone unnoticed by Ilda. She quickly turned her head and said her opinion. I don't know, Ilda. It's hard to decide. It all depends on their planning. But I bet it will look cool. As Uraraka mimicked explosions and shooting ice, Ilda looked on at his classmates. While he did not like Bakugo at all, and didn't really have an opinion of Todoroki besides his somewhat blunt and rude attitude, he didn't want to see them kill each other over a small medal. He knew that Todoroki would most likely not go all out in order to keep the crowd safe. But the same couldn't be said for Bakugo. All right, announced Midnight, as Todoroki and Bakugo walked up to shake hands. Shake on a good match, and then we can begin. As Todoroki put his hand out, Bakugo grabbed it and put an unreasonable amount of pressure on it. Todoroki, to his credit however, didn't even flinch as he looked up at the smirking Bakugo. You might just want to walk off the arena while you still can, ice bastard. Bakugo whispered to Todoroki maliciously. Because I'll be walking out of the ring at the end of the match, while you'll be in the hospital wing. Todoroki nodded. I see. You're trying to amp yourself up to believe that you'll win. It's a good tactic. To make yourself believe you'll win will probably increase your odds of winning to some extent. He then gave a cold glare of his own. But I wonder what will happen if you were to lose after all of motivation. Bakugo snarled as he let go of his bone-crushing grip on Todoroki's hand. Both boys got onto opposite sides of the ring. Midnight raised her hand. Get ready, get set. Bakugo wore a smile that radiated bloodlust at the boy that stood opposite of him. He was going to kick his ass. Make him wish he had never been born. He was the strongest hero alive. Todoroki, however, had different thoughts. The dual-haired boy's eyes narrowed at the blonde, who had on a look that promised pain. Todoroki, however, couldn't have cared less. This explosion boy was nothing. Nothing but a mere stepping stone to fighting Izuku. If he beat him, then he could beat the green-haired boy. If he couldn't, well, he would just have to amplify his training. Both boys got into fighting positions as Bakugo made little explosions in his hands, as Todoroki had an ice blast at the ready. The crowd held their breath. This was it. Go. And that's what happened. Jean looked slightly irritated as Kia finished. She was not impressed that it took a day for reports of the attack to reach her. Many other knights had returned to her the day earlier, reporting to her the city's conditions and the villagers' health. Amber, Lisa, and Kia, who were three of her most loyal knights, however, had taken their time, with no excuse beside the fact they were help training recruits. Recruits whom she had never before today. One of them, a green-haired boy, had an aura that emitted nervousness and kindness. He looked as though he were a foreigner, due to his green hair and lack of knowledge of the city, when Jean had questioned the boy where he had first went when arriving in the city. The other recruit was a rather strange being. She was a tiny, white-haired girl who had a somewhat brash attitude. She had easily found out that her name was Paimon, due to referring to herself as her own name instead of I. One thing she noticed about the girl was that she was very overprotective about her green-haired friend. She had later found out in the conversation that this Izuku, she had figured out the name thanks to Paimon's story, had saved her life from drowning, and she owed him with her life. Jean had also noticed a lack of noise after Paimon had told this story. Kia and Lisa had looked concerned at this revelation. Due to their reactions, Jean assumed that despite recruiting them, they did not know everything about the recruits' pasts. Even Amber, whom Jean could tell upon entry to the room disliked Paimon, refrained herself from making any sort of comment. Had anyone looked closer, they would have seen a tiny bit of pity mixed with worry in the brown-haired girl's eyes. Only when Lisa and Kia had then asked Paimon about how she had ended up in the river did Paimon cease her storytelling of Izuku's brave arrival. The little girl had gazed at Izuku when she had stopped, and Izuku had nodded. Paimon did not reveal anything about herself other than that. After the sudden conclusion of the story, Kia had reported his findings to her along with Amber and Lisa. "I see," Jean murmured. She then looked at Kia and the other knights of Favonius. "All registered knights, stand up." Izuku was surprised when Paimon did not move from hanging off his shoulder in an attempt to get up to join the other knights. He looked over at her to see that her eyes were distant as she clutched onto Izuku's shoulder tighter and let out a sigh of relief. He gave a small, reassuring smile at her as he turned his attention back to the three knights, who were standing side by side in front of Jean. "While it is true that the reports you gave me were acceptable, the timing of them were not," she said as Amber flinched. Lisa looked at the Grandmaster with an impassive expression, while Kia looked at a wall, chuckling nervously. Jean addressed them all again. "Furthermore, this will be on your records. Do something close to this again, and I will replace you with a more worthy candidate of your current position. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, ma'am," they all shouted simultaneously. Jean nodded in approval before turning her attention to Izuku. "So, Izuku was it? I was informed that you would like to become a Knight of Favonius. But when we begin, I will have to ask you some questions. My name is Jean. I am the acting Grand Master of the Knights of Favonius. Pleased to make your acquaintance." The woman smiled as she held out her hand to him. "The pleasure's all in mine," Izuku said as he shook her hand. "He's polite, and has a rather tight grip." The Grandmaster thought to herself. "I could tell he wasn't even trying to grip my hand tightly. Should he pass the test, he will become a strong knight." "If you paid attention to my words," Jean began again, looking at Izuku, "you'd have noticed that I said, 'when we begin.' Sadly, we are not beginning any time soon. We have a problem on our hands and are much too busy to conduct tests. Lisa, if you will." "Sure thing. You see, darling." Lisa smirked a little when Izuku turned a bit redder and heard Amber's breathing get louder. Storm Terror had caused quite a ruckus in this region since its recent resurgence. Basically, Mondstadt's elemental sphere and ley lines are not unlike a yarn ball in the paws of a kitten. For mages, it's much worse. My skin is one elemental particle away from a terrible breakout. That being said, Jean sighed as she pinched the brick of her nose while looking up. "We're stuck. We can't run any tests until this interference is over." Izuku looked over at the rest of the Knights of Favonius, who were all looking grim. If he was stuck here, why not do something to make it easier for them? "Anything I can do to help?" "Temples of the Four Winds." That's what she said. Izuku was now walking down a stairwell in town with Amber. After being thanked by a grateful Jean had revealed that the source of this reoccurring problem were these temples, as the Storm Terror was drawing power from these structures. Lisa, Kia, and Jean herself were all going to different temples to halt the power, while Izuku, Paimon, and Amber were headed to another, further away temple. "By the way, you should feel honored being in Jean's presence," Amber said, regaining her old, smug personality. "You simpletons should be on your knees thanking her for letting you go to a temple with me. I understand if you won't be able to do much, but I promise that I'll take care of you." Amber grinned at Paimon's furious expression as she attempted to lunge at the brown-haired archer, only to be stopped by Izuku's hand holding her back. Paimon looked at the boy pleadingly, as though begging him with her eyes if she could attack the archer. He sighed as he shook his head and turned his sight back to the bridge ahead of them. He made a sudden halt which caused Amber to face plant onto the green-haired boy's back. Amber's eyes widened when she felt strong muscles beneath the shirt. "He doesn't look like much on the outside, but he's more muscular than I thought. Wait, what am I thinking?" A red-faced Amber peeled herself off of Izuku's back as Paimon snorted at the blushing Amber and Izuku, who hadn't noticed her bump into him. Izuku turned around with a comforting smile, which made the archer's blush deepen, much to Paimon's amusement. "Amber?" Do you have a map on you by any chance? Izuku asked the brown-haired girl. Amber tried to hide her blush as best as she could by turning around the opposite way before addressing him. I do. I have already read the location of where we're supposed to go. It's quite far, so we'll have to camp overnight. She stammered. Before Paimon could tease Amber about her stutter, Izuku addressed the archer again. So, you said we have to control my power. Do you think we start training tomorrow? Amber's slight blush faded as she thought about his question. I think we should, yes. It's better if we help you shape up now than later. If your ability is anything like my magic, then it still should be the basic principle. What do you call that ability of yours anyway? Izuku gulped. He had to tell Amber. He had no choice. If she were to teach him, it should be fine that she could know. Besides, no one in this world knew anything about quirks. So, with those main points out of the way, Izuku saw no reason why he couldn't tell her. I call it one for all. As Izuku said his quirk's name, Paimon felt something strange inside of her. As though her blood had given her a slight shock when she heard those words. But as soon as she noticed it, it faded away. Paimon floated there for a second before brushing it off. It was probably the meat she had eaten earlier. After all, she did eat a lot of it. One for all that's a rather interesting name you chose for it, but okay, tomorrow, we begin your unofficial training for the Knights of Favonius Izuku, as I will be your temporary mentor, Amber announced proudly. Please refrain from praising my greatness during our training sessions, although I know that will be Hey, Paimon shouted suddenly. Both Izuku and Amber turned to face the little girl, who was scowling at Amber. What's with the sudden change of heart? Yesterday, you bragged about how Paimon and Izuku were never going to make it into the Knights of Favonius. Now, you're fine with it because you're a mentor. What happened to, you'll never make it in? Had a change of heart. Amber waved her off in a dismissive manner, much to the white-haired girl's fury. Couldn't care less if you made it in. But Izuku has potential. We would be fools to let it go to waste. The witch should care if Paimon gets in, Paimon yelled at the archer. Paimon is a valuable asset to the team. Stop calling me a witch, you snowflake, Amber roared back at the girl, who didn't back down. Izuku chuckled to himself as Paimon and Amber made their way across the bridge and towards one of the faraway temples. Jean stared up at the storming clouds. The town had not cleared up since the attack. While the attack did have some benefits, as bandits were now too scared to come near the town, there were many repairs to be made. And the town's fate now rested in the eyes of her hot-headed outrider, somewhat charming ice mage, flirtatious lightning witch, and potential recruits. She couldn't help but feel as though sometimes the gods purposely messed with her. Miss Jean, are you all right? Jean turned her head to the voice. There stood a female maid wearing a priestess hat and a cravat. She wore a crimson dress with two bows, one at the hip and the other near her rear. White armor adorned her chest along with a pauldron on her left shoulder. She wore black tights beneath armored boots. Her neck-length lavender hair swung slightly in the breeze as her olive-green eyes were filled with concern and worry. I'll be fine, Noel. Jean addressed the maid as she turned around to look her in the eye. Noel frowned as Jean gave a tired smile. All in a day's work, I suppose. Not enough people available at the moment, so we had to send out a new recruit. Noel's eyes widened considerably. With all due respect, Miss Jean, Noel began. I don't think sending a new recruit to deal with a threat such as this was a very thought-out idea. You could No, I am not sending you out. Jean sighed as Noel grumbled slightly. You need to look after the village, should the storm terror attack again. I need to run some errands. Take care of the place while I'm gone. And while I know we need more people, do not call anyone else without my permission. Especially her. Good. Take care and sorry for the short notice. As Jean left the room, Noel grumbled to herself. I am useful. And she's struggling. Why doesn't she send me out? She pondered. Oh well, I know she refused this, but I'm going to call for help. For Jean's sake. Noel strode over to a nearby table, grabbed a feather, and dipped it in ink. She then gently sat down as she began to write. I know Jean said especially not that woman. Noel thought as she wrote. But she would be a valuable asset as of right now. Sorry, Jean, but I'm going to have to disobey your orders. Paimon's nose twitched as she smelled the fresh morning air. It had been approximately 16 hours since they had left to rid Mondstadt of the storm terror for good. According to Amber, one of the temples were near a location named Falcon Coast. Izuku had asked the archer why no one had gone into the temple before. only for Amber to tell him that the temple was full of traps and tests, and that getting through the entrance alone was an achievement to be proud of. So where were the group of three as of right now? A drowsy Izuku and Paimon had been awakened from their sleep by a jaunty Amber. For what reason? Training. Amber saw potential in Izuku. Now all she had to do was awaken it. He had an insane amount of strength for someone of his age, hell, for any age. If she could help him use his power to its fullest extent without breaking himself, then the Knights of Favonius could possibly be known across the world as the strongest guild. But to be a skilled warrior required much training. Which was why Amber was now calling Paimon over to heal Izuku, who had broken all the fingers on his right hand to crush multiple boulders. Interesting. Amber mused as Paimon flew over and began to heal Izuku, all the while scowling at Amber for having Izuku injure himself. This had been the third time the brown-haired girl had Izuku break boulders. Thankfully, they had camped right next to a mountain, so finding boulders weren't much on an issue. Although they had to be careful, one false move could cause an avalanche of rocks to rain down upon where they had set up, in the middle of a nearby grassy plain. Right before Amber could give Izuku her thoughts, she saw it again. Something the brown-haired girl hadn't seen since the Storm Terror attack. Another spark danced on Izuku's neck and traveled up Paimon and merged into her skin. For a split second, Amber swore the green spark had turned a shade of yellow, but it had disappeared before she could make any sort of confirmation. So, are you going to explain why you keep doing that to Snowflake? Amber asked Izuku, who sat up and looked at her confusedly. It's okay, witch. Paimon doesn't mind healing Izuku. It doesn't hurt Paimon at all. Paimon puffed her chest out and huffed proudly. Amber's eye slightly twitched at the annoying nickname, but disregarded it. Yelling at the little puffball wouldn't benefit her in any way. Not that part, Paimon. Amber almost had to force out the name in order to have them know she was being serious. And it worked. Paimon looked at Amber bewildered, shocked that the archer had called her by her actual name. I meant the part where that spark goes into your skin. Both Izuku and Paimon looked confused. What are you talking about? Paimon asked as Izuku began to look at Paimon's arms, to see if there were any marks. I've noticed it ever since the Ocorn attack. Every time you use your ability, and she comes to heal you. Amber gestured towards Paimon. A spark smaller than the size of an acorn goes into her skin. Do either of you know why? The duo looked slightly unnerved at the information given. Then, a thought sprung into Izuku's head. Maybe she loses some of her energy, and One for All gives it back to her, Izuku suggested as Paimon nodded at Izuku's hypothesis. Or, the witch uses so much of her magic, she can't see right. Paimon proposed as Amber let out a hiss. I know how to wield my magic, you pipsqueak. Amber growled as she and Paimon had a glaring contest. That was interrupted by Izuku coughing. So, what do you think about my ability, Amber? Izuku asked tentatively as Amber looked at him before donning a thoughtful, but serious expression. You can use your ability anywhere on your body, due to you being able to transfer it to your legs, arms, and fingers as you've demonstrated before. Paimon nodded to Amber's statement, remembering how she had told them about Izuku breaking his legs to save her. However, I'm going to try and teach you how to control how much energy you put in. Izuku nodded, intent on learning to control his power. Amber beckoned him to come closer, which he instantly obliged. Amber then held her bow out in an attack stance as she loaded an arrow. Watch carefully. As her finger made contact with the bow, a familiar red, fiery magic began to crawl up the arrow until it reached the head, which instantly turned a bright shade of red. She then took aim at a nearby tree, took a deep breath and fired. The moment the arrow made contact with tree, the whole trunk burst into flames. The fire then slowly began to eat away at the tree as it slowly traveled upwards, as it lit the leaves on fire as well. Within 45 seconds, the whole tree had been incinerated. Do you see? Asked Amber as she threw her bow to the side, making it instantly disappear. Notice how I only used a little energy, yet I still set the whole tree on fire. I'm going to teach you how you can use portions of your strength instead of everything at once. As she turned back, however, she noticed that Izuku and Paimon were both gaping at her. What is it? Amber asked, turning a little red. Is something wrong? Paimon then turned to Izuku, wearing a victorious smile. See, Izuku? Paimon was right. The girl is a witch. Amber snarled. What part of that demonstration makes me a witch, Snowflake? You threw your bow to the side, and it instantly disappeared. I knew you would reveal your true self eventually, Paimon announced jovially. Amber blinked at her as she looked from Izuku to Paimon and back. The archer then began to giggle and snort. When Paimon had finished her little rant about how smart she was for knowing the whole time, Amber had her hands on her knees and was keeled from laughing so hard. "What's so funny? You can't lie your way out of this one, witch." Paimon fumed as Izuku, who had decided to take the best course of action and ignore them, stood up and walked over to a nearby boulder to begin to try and control his power. He grit his teeth as he felt one for all power run through his hand and into his finger. Amber, meanwhile, had just recovered from her laughing fit. She was still wheezing, attempting to catch her breath. She giggled as she wiped a tear from her eye. The girl who wants to be part of the Knights of Favonius, doesn't even know how weapon summoning is done. Wow, you guys really are hopeless. She laughed at Paimon's embarrassed, red face, who was thinking of a comeback. Boom! An enormous gale of wind rose from where Izuku had been standing. Paimon's cape flew behind her in the wind, as Amber's hair bow almost came off before she grabbed it. Trees were rustling, and the grass blew with the wind as it died down. They both looked around at Izuku, who was clutching his hand. Instead of coming over to them, however, he kept his gaze locked on his hand, grinning ever so slightly, looking. Amber's eyes made their way over to the boulder, which, instead of being in hundreds of pieces, were in much larger pieces. She then walked over to Izuku and Paimon, who was healing the boy's finger. Izuku was muttering under his breath while looking excitedly at his hand, which was broken and red. But Amber realized why he was muttering a storm. While the hand looked bad and beaten, it was not as disfigured as she had seen it when he had used it before. Izuku, however, had felt something different that time when he had used it. Almost as if his body put on the metaphorical brakes. When his finger flicked out, some of the power had remained inside of him. He couldn't feel it anymore, not knowing whether it had disappeared when he had fired, or if it were because his nerves in his hand were shot. "Why your hands?" Amber stuttered as she quickly regained composure. "Alright, that was not a bad first attempt. But you still have much work to do to even come close to half my level. Amber broke off because of the green-haired boy pulling her into a tight embrace. "Thanks, Amber. I felt something different that time. You comparing our skills helped me." As Izuku pulled away, Amber was wearing a blank expression. She didn't move, nor did her facial expression change. After about 30 seconds of quick conversation with Paimon about the events that had occurred in the last 30 seconds, Izuku noticed this and grew a bit worried. "What's wrong with her? Do you think she's okay?" Paimon just sniggered as she flew over to the unresponsive Amber. She then made a fist and put her tiny hand on top of her knuckles. With all of her little might, she slammed her hands down on Amber's head. Amber suddenly regained her sense, feeling a sharp pain in her head. She looked up at a grinning Paimon. She scowled, about to yell at the girl again, before remembering what had happened. As she recalled what had happened, her face became slowly redder and redder. "Amber, are you feeling okay?" Izuku asked tentatively, getting closer to the blushing girl and unknowingly made things worse. Amber's hold on her magic weakened from the sudden outburst of emotion and lit the grass around her on fire. Izuku yelped as he jumped back from the girl, who had now fallen over, face red and looking dizzy. The fires that had been lit suddenly vanished as Amber's body hit the ground with a loud thud. "Amber!" Izuku shrieked as he ran over to the girl, ignorant to Paimon's hysterical laughter. "Oh no, something must have bitten her. Paimon, heal her." Paimon looked down at the steaming red face of the archer and snorted. "Paimon, doesn't think she's injured." "Wait, really? How do you know?" Izuku questioned, looking curious and slightly concerned at the unaware Amber. Paimon tried not to face palm. He was her savior. He truly was. But he was sometimes so incredibly dense. A girl passes out after he hugs her, and his first thought is that something bit her. Just a gut feeling. But Paimon knows she's right. "Paimon, heal her." "But do it now, Paimon," Izuku ordered. He wasn't one for giving orders or for following them, given how he had obtained his quirk, but Paimon's attitude perplexed him. He couldn't wrap his head around why Amber had fainted after a simple hug. Was she just more fragile than she looked? "Fine." Paimon gave in, but suddenly gained a slightly evil grin, which she quickly hid from Izuku in order not to make him angry. The little girl then cleared her throat and turned to Amber, who was still as unresponsive as before. "Paimon knows an ancient magic, but it is required that those not involved with the spell must turn away," Paimon said in a mysterious, knowing tone. "Paimon will have to ask Izuku to turn away Tilda." Izuku nodded as he turned away, covering his eyes. Paimon then chanted random words, in order for it to sound believable. "Eye of Dragon. Hair of Newt. Wake up this girl. from within her roots. She then, with all of her strength, and with Izuku covering his eyes, the little white-haired girl reared her hand back and slapped Amber across the face. The resounding asterisk crack asterisk that followed was so loud it made birds in the nearby trees flew away. There was silence in the clearing until it was interrupted by a painful shriek. Amber had snapped out of her daze, holding her check, glowering at Paimon, who was chortling from what she had done. "You, insignificant, little." Izuku removed his hand and opened his eyes, turning back to the two women as he did so. He had expected to see Amber trying to deny she needed help, who was supposed to be being teased by Paimon. However, he did not expect to turn around to see a demented Amber looming over a laughing Paimon, not unlike a predator that had just found its prey. Sensing danger, he quickly jumped in front of Amber. "Hey, are you okay? You suddenly passed out. Did something bite you?" Amber suddenly remembered what had happened and bit her lip while turning a bit red. She would have to lie her way out for this one. Yeah, something must have gotten in my undershirt. What's okay? I feel great now. It's all thanks to Paimon's healing, right? Which? Paimon asked cheerfully. If looks could kill, then Paimon would have turned to dust under Amber's seething glare. This time, however, Izuku noticed the glare. Hey, he quickly caught Amber's attention, who had yet to regain her composure and was still blazing with fury at the girl, who was finally beginning to calm down. I get that the spell must have hurt a little, but why don't you thank her? She did save you after all. To Izuku's confusion and Paimon's increasing amusement, the green-haired boy has just managed to make things worse. Amber had gone from furious to positively terrifying. The archer was livid, but she didn't have a choice. If she didn't do this, then Izuku would ask why she wouldn't. That would most certainly not end well for her. She then turned to Paimon and forced an unnatural smile on her face as she increased her glare. Thank why you. Paimon giggled. Paimon was glad to help, but Paimon hopes that the witch will be more careful next time. You never know what could get you in these outlands, Tilda. If one could read minds, they would have probably gotten a headache from hearing how loudly Amber was screaming in her head. Are we almost there? Yup. We should be getting there very soon. Amber, Paimon, and Izuku walked down the path together, nearing the temple near Falcon Coast. After a breakfast that had been eaten in an uncomfortable silence, they had set off. Amber had let go of the livid persona she had taken on and had cooled off. Paimon had stopped teasing her for the moment, a bit fearful that the witch would die of a heart attack if she got any angrier. Izuku had started a bit of small conversation between he and the rest of the group, most of the conversation revolving around him. Why did you save Lisa? Amber had asked, recalling the fight between the lightning mage and the boy. You shot that attack to hurt her, and yet you still saved her. Why is that? Izuku looked up at the partly cloudy sky. He honestly didn't know how to respond to that. After he fired the attack, he saw Lisa's face, which wore a look of both surprise and accepting defeat. She had admitted defeat, and that was good enough for him. He didn't want to see her get hurt because of an attack he had launched. While she had gone a little insane in their fight, he knew that she still meant well. She was a loyal knight of Favonius who was willing to take the attack head-on rather than dodge it, as a sign of defeat and as a sign of respect for the boy. At least, that's what he thought anyway. It looked like she was asking for help, so I helped her. Izuku responded, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. Amber donned a look of confusion as Paimon looked on at Izuku with pride. Paimon not only stayed with Izuku, but also looked up to him. His selfless nature, his willingness to protect others, and his kind attitude made him a respectable role model for the white-haired girl. Amber, however, looked perplexed. He had won, and yet he had shoved Lisa out of harm's way. He had every right to gloat or to brag. Instead, his first thoughts had been to get Lisa help to heal her. She couldn't comprehend why he had done what he did. They took a sudden turn on the road and came to a massive door that resembled a closed gate. A cross sat as a symbol on the structure as the crack in the doors glowed turquoise. This is it, Amber said with a steely glint in her eye. One of the temples. Now, there's plenty to go around. All Might was outside the stadium in the city, signing people's books and taking pictures. The women around him kept swooning whenever he smiled at them, as the men said aloud how much of an inspiration he was. The man let out a hearty laugh as his blonde hair blew in the breeze. The blonde-haired man, in his muscle form, had gone outside to the paparazzi. To anyone with common sense, it looked as though he wanted attention. But that was not the case. He was there as a distraction, a very convincing one at that. He knew that both Bakugo and Todoroki had a large amount of power at their fingertips. It would be very easy for a large explosion to send the surrounding city into a panic. All he had to do was wait. Wait for the match to end, and to get back to Aizawa, to find out if they had any new on young Midoriya's whereabouts. "Excuse me, All Might, sir?" a nearby blonde-haired teenager asked worriedly. "I heard explosions and yelling. Is ever." "Do not worry, civilian." All Might gave the teenager his signature smile. "It's only the students fighting in the US Sports Festival. All is well, I can assure you that." The blonde-haired boy gave a shaky smile. "Thank you, sir, but it sounds bad from out here. With all due respect, are you sure everything is okay?" The pro-hero waved him off. "Everything is fine, do not worry. They're not trying to kill each other or anything of that matter." The crowd gave a gasp of shock as a huge explosion rocked the stadium. "Are they trying to kill each other?" Hilda demanded angrily as a pillar of ice shot up from the arena. Bakugo snarled as he spun on one of his feet and ignited his right hand. He then unleashed an explosive punch at Todoroki, who in response summoned a wall of ice in order to block the ferocious attack. The explosion then backfired due to the sturdy wall, and Bakugo was shot back, quickly regaining his footing by propelling himself forward with little explosions. Both boys looked remotely damaged and tired. Bakugo was covered in his sweat that amplified his explosions. However, it could also stop them or backfire if he were drenched in it. Todoroki didn't look much better. His teeth were chattering as the ice was beginning to spread towards the other side of his body. Bakugo let out a growl as he spat blood onto the ground. He wiped his sweaty forehead as he seethed at the dual-haired boy that stood opposite of him. How dare he? He thought he could blow him off like the rest of his opponents. Oh, how the explosive boy would prove him wrong. He had the best, mightiest quirk alive. Not half-and-half bastard, not Deku, him, Katsuki Bakugo. He would beat them all and prove himself the strongest. But, despite all the anger and rage, Bakugo found himself slightly irritated and concerned. If Deku never came back, how the hell would he be able to kick his weak ass? As much as he hated to admit it, Deku beat him in a one-on-one fight. If he didn't beat him, then how could he call himself the strongest? He could never become the #1 hero with the fact that Deku beat him hanging over him for the rest of his life. The blonde snarled as he threw himself at his shivering opponent, who in turn summoned another wall of ice, which further spread the ice on his body. Bakugo sneered as he propelled himself over the wall of ice and over Todoroki. He spun around in the air before delivering a harsh uppercut to Todoroki, who was thrown back. In response, the dual-haired boy summoned another wall of ice, as he used it to stop himself from falling out of the ring. Todoroki stifled a groan as blood dripped from his nose onto the ground. He was trying his hardest, yet Bakugo wasn't giving up. But no matter how much he pushed him, Todoroki knew that he wasn't going to use his quirk. If he did use his quirk, he could win this in an instant. But no. He would win with his mother's ice. "This is nothing," Todoroki stated as he looked over at Bakugo, whose chest was heaving. "You are nothing. Midoriya might be able to." Todoroki was cut off as Bakugo let out a feral roar as he lunged at the dual-haired boy again, who in turn took a fighting stance. Both boys were fighting for superiority. One of them would emerge victorious. For the first and last time, Bakugo roared as his exploding fist smashed through Todoroki's ice and attempted to blast the boy with a bigger explosion. "Stop comparing me to that weak ass. He's not even here." "Izuku, is something wrong?" Paimon looked over at Izuku, who was silently gazing at a nearby tree, completely unfocused and unaware of Amber's grumbled swear words as she attempted to open the gate-like door. Izuku had been completely silent, thinking while thinking about his world. He had almost forgotten completely about Bakugo. How he declared that he wouldn't be beat by the green-haired boy again. How he would surpass All Might. How would Katsuki rival him when he was in another world? The words that Bakugo had said that moment Izuku had chased after him after school had stuck with the boy ever since. While it was rude, Izuku translated it as Bakugo's way of finally accepting him for not being a stepping stone anymore. How it was his way of saying that he accepted Izuku. Had Izuku told anyone else in his old world this, they would have asked him if he were all right in the head. "Izuku, please say something." At this point Izuku looked up. Both Amber and Paimon looked on at him, slightly worried and unnerved. While Izuku had been quiet before and had been somewhat unresponsive, he had never gone this long without saying something. He had been sitting at the entrance to the temple for an hour and a half, staring off into the distance. Paimon had seen something she had never seen before in his eyes. Sadness. She had thought Izuku had been someone who always smiled, someone who understood and would console you. To see sadness in his eyes, in her perspective, was saddening and strangely consoling. While she was not at all content with how Izuku was behaving and how he was feeling, it was comforting to know that he understood how she had felt back in her village. How he was still human, and a boy at that. It made her feel better to know that she hadn't suffered alone. Sorry. I was lost in thought. Izuku responded sheepishly, rubbing the back of his head as he stood up and stretched. What were you thinking about? Paimon asked curiously. Things. What kind of things? You know, stuff. What kind of stuff? Izuku stifled a groan as Paimon grinned victoriously. He knew she would keep pestering her until he told her. Well, I guess you can say I'm feeling a little homesick. Izuku stammered slightly. Both Amber and Paimon noticed this stutter. While it was quite common for Izuku to stutter and stammer in front of new people, especially women, he had mostly gotten rid of it when talking to them. Both of the women, however, quickly figured out that he missed his homeland. Oh, maybe I can help, Amber suggested cheerfully, removing a book from her back pouch and skimming through its pages. She then stopped at a certain page. Where are you from? Dragonspine? Anemoculus? Geoculus? None of those. Izuku said, not meeting their eyes. A sudden chill ran up his spine. Should he tell them? Maybe this world had its own version of Japan. And even if they didn't, he could just tell them that he's from somewhere far away. That wasn't technically a lie. What's the worst that could happen? Izuku turned back over to Amber and Paimon. I'm from a faraway place called Japan. Both Amber and Paimon's eyes widened at this. Japan? But then that means they know Japan? Thank goodness, Izuku thought, content and relieved. That you're a foreigner from an undiscovered location, Tilda, Amber squealed delightedly, as she pulled out a pen from her pouch. Paimon bobbed her head up and down, excited to hear about her hero's homeland. So, what's this? Wapen like? Amber asked excitedly as she got right into Izuku's face, who was now too worried about keeping his secret to notice that there was a pretty girl in his personal space. Damn, they don't know? Looks like I'm back to square one. Izuku thought as he turned to Amber. First of all, it's Japan, not Wapan. And it's a very nice place. Lots of buildings and nice people. Izuku said as he noticed Amber writing in her little book. He needed more information about this world before he gave all the information of his own. Izuku then expertly dodged a bullet by focusing their attention on something else. But let's get back on track. Why isn't the door open yet? Amber's happy grin was replaced with a scowl as she put her book and pen away, stood up straight, and walked back over to the door and kicked it. I don't know why. I've done everything Jean told me to do to open it, and it still won't budge. The brown-haired girl frowned. Maybe it's because this is one of the temples related to the Storm Terrors. Yes, that would make sense considering the dragon is busy destroying crud, and this door won't open. Wait. Izuku turned around, bewildered. The Storm Terror's temple. As in the same Storm Terror who attacked the village. The very same. Amber commented as she looked back at the temple to see if anything had changed. Storm Terror was once part of the Four Winds, believe it or not. Eh? Paimon shouted, her eyes bugging out. WN? Why? How? Careful, Snowflake, or your eyes might pop onto the ground. Amber snickered as Paimon huffed at her, but still looked fairly bewildered. Right before she could enlighten the young girl, they heard a fierce murmuring coming from beside them. They both looked over to see Izuku, starting at the temple, whispering to himself. Storm Terror was once part of the Four Winds. It doesn't make sense. The P-plane Thevillage seemed to find open the Four Winds will its author destroying their village. It doesn't make sense, of course it could be because. Amber stared at Izuku strangely as his muttering increased the more he looked at the temple. She then took a few cautious steps back from the boy, just in case. Wow, I know it was a bit shocking information, but he seems to be going insane. He's talking to some invisible person, Amber thought, staring at the boy who had yet to cease his muttering. Amber then walked over to him and waved her hand in front of his face. She then charged her hand with a bit of her fire magic, causing it to immediately start burning and turned a shade of red and orange. Whoa, Paimon shrieked as pushed Amber over, her fire magic vanishing as she hit the ground. What are you doing, witch? Amber looked confused. I think he's possessed by something, so I'm going to. No, Paimon shouted. He? Does that a lot? Amber looked over at Izuku, who still hadn't noticed the situation. He was still muttering to himself, enough to make a person like herself to think that he had gone insane. Paimon saw Amber's questioning look and sighed. She then flew over to Izuku and punched him in the back of the head. Izuku immediately winced as his head throbbed from the impact. Strange, he didn't think Paimon had that much strength. It felt as though Uraraka had hit him on the back of the head, and not a little girl. Why was that? Izuku dismissed this thought as he rubbed the back of his head embarrassedly. Sorry. Won't happen again. That's a lie. Paimon chirped up, causing Izuku to laugh a little. Amber snorted at the strange boy before she suddenly donned a serious expression and looked away. Paimon and Izuku immediately stopped talking when they saw the look on Amber's face. Something's off. I don't know why, but something feels different. She looked over at the temple, the stars shining above their head. The temple was glowing a bit, almost as if, "Hey look, a full moon," Paimon shouted excitedly as she gazed at it wonderingly. Izuku looked over at Paimon and smiled. Paimon's hair matched the moon's glow. He had just noticed that. Paimon looked over at Izuku before floating up and down excitedly, all while pointing at the white ball in the sky. Izuku, do you think that people live up there? Do you think the moon's made of cheese? Do you think? Paimon rambled on, staring at the moon happily. Amber was reading over the note Jean gave her. Let's see. Wait until night. Be there at all times in case. Okay, that's great, but how do we open it? A gust of wind blew along the landscape, ruffling Paimon's hair and causing Izuku to laugh. It also caused Amber to drop her note, which she picked up confused. Wait, there's a backside? She immediately realized the mistake of saying this out loud. She had been so focused on the first set of instructions that she hadn't bothered to see if there were more. Both Paimon and Izuku ripped their gazes away from the moon and were now starting at her. Paimon's gaze was full of anger for being held there for so long for such a stupid reason, and Izuku looked on at her with a deadpan expression. Amber coughed, blushing before she read the instructions. After about 30 seconds, she frowned while looking up at the starry sky. She looked back down at the note before she looked back up at the sky again. What Izuku and Paimon weren't expecting was for Amber to grab them and throw them away from the gate, diving with them. Immediately after this, a blinding light filled the area. Izuku squinted while looking back while Paimon screamed, thinking they were under attack and holding on to him for dear life. Amber, however, looked on in awe. Then, after a few seconds, the light died down, revealing the temple in all of its glory, glowing and open for the world to enter. Izuku and Paimon looked over at the blushing Amber. So, I missed the backside, and it said when the moon was right over the temple, it would open. But you had to be further away from the temple so you don't go blind, she whispered. Paimon was furious that they had sat there for hours for no good reason. Right before she could give the red-faced archer a piece of her mind, Izuku grabbed her shoulder. She looked over at Izuku as he sighed and shook his head as he leaned over to the floating girl's ear. We all make mistakes, he whispered to Paimon as Amber turned to them, still red-faced, and bowed. I apologize for wasting your time, she said, although it sounded a little forced. Paimon looked at her unhappily before waving her off, causing Amber to nod and began to walk towards the temple. You might not like Amber that much, but she just did something unbelievably hard for her, Izuku whispered as he continued. She owned up to it. She knew what she did and didn't make an excuse. She seems to have a lot of pride in herself, so it must have been especially hard for her. I could tell she wanted to make an excuse, yet she didn't. Let me tell you something, Paimon. He then noticed Amber standing a fair distance away, tapping her foot. He then turned to Paimon and murmured, pride is the mask of one's own faults. I had fully expected Amber to make an excuse. Maybe, if this were the Amber we had first met, she would have. But she sacrificed a bit of her pride for us and her town. She's changed a bit, not too much, just a little bit. But you've got to give her some time and room, okay? Paimon nodded at Izuku's words as he smiled at her. They both then turned as Izuku walked back over to Amber with Paimon floating above him. He then nodded and Paimon, who looked at Amber and muttered a quick, thank you. Amber looked on a bit in surprise before nodding. She then beckoned them to follow her, and the trio entered the shining temple, ready to face whatever may lay ahead. Izuku looked around the wet, closed, dark interior as Paimon slightly shivered from her spot on his shoulder as Amber silently treaded alongside him down the long staircase. It had been at least 30 minutes since they had opened the gate and had entered the temple, and Izuku was less than impressed. Amber had rambled on about many different subjects. Weapon summoning, the rumors surrounding a temple, how every time the gate opened the temple changed, about the monsters that lurked within, and about the mind-boggling puzzles that the temples were rumored to have. Paimon had been doing all right up until the mention of monsters. When the rumors of the creatures of the temple had been brought up, Paimon had latched herself onto Izuku's shoulder and had refused to move from her position. Amber had found amusement in this at first, but soon began ignoring it when they had hit the 15-minute mark. The green-haired boy couldn't help but wonder if had entered the wrong temple, or had maybe they had came at the wrong time. So, Izuku suddenly spoke up, making the archer and little girl slightly jump from the sudden spark of conversation. Do you know how long it takes to get to the main interior of the temple? Amber huffed as the trio stopped and pulled out her little book, throwing a bit of her fire magic on nearby moss as a source of light. She then flipped through the book, progressively getting more annoyed the more that she read on each page that she stopped on. Nothing, she responded impatiently as the fire on the moss became larger due to her annoyance. I thought this book would have more information on the temples, but there's still nothing. Has anyone ever been in this temple? Paimon asked as Amber flushed a little. The archer spun on her heel and looked over at the wall, refusing to meet Paimon's questioning gaze. Well, someone once went into another temple, so it's the same thing, right? Amber mumbled as the flames on the wall became even wilder, due to her emotions. Hey guys, Izuku said, gazing at the wall that Amber had thrown her fire on, which continued to burn brightly. Paimon seemed to be visibly restraining herself from making a comment, so she decided to choose the best option and turn to Izuku. What is it, Izuku? She asked, her voice tinted with a bit faux her annoyance. Look at the wall, Amber's burning. He told them, his eyes not leaving the wall to check if they were listening. Both girls turned to the wall to see a surprising, but welcoming sight. While the moss continued to burn and shrivel, it had begun to melt away, revealing sunlight streaming through the flaming moss. But they were too far underground to be close to the surface, meaning since there was a sunlight opening, which meant there was probably a cave nearby. Amber grinned. See? That's probably it. Ha! All thanks to me. You're welcome, you too. Man, the things that would have happened if I weren't here. Paimon was trying to quickly think up a plan, so she wouldn't have to listen to the outriders boasting. She looked over at the fire, which was still slowly eating away at the moss. An idea suddenly popped into her head. She smiled and began to taunt the brown-haired girl. So Izuku, the witch back at the Knight's headquarters, really appreciated you, huh? At this, Paimon knew she had struck gold. While Izuku was naive to what she truly meant, Amber was not. Amber grit her teeth and clenched her fists as the fire on the moss burned so wildly that it began to catch a few of the surrounding rocks on fire for a few seconds. Soon, the fire ate away at the moss completely, but the group still couldn't see anything because of the dancing flames. Amber still hadn't calmed down yet. Could Izuku go check if Amber is okay? Paimon asked Izuku with a little bit of concern. Izuku nodded as he turned around. Amber now looked a little insane, her eyes wide as she was stuttering something under her breath. As Amber was whispering to herself something Izuku couldn't make out, he looked at Paimon tentatively as she nodded. He then placed his hand on her shoulder. Are you okay, Amber? You're being a little weird. Amber felt the weight on her shoulder and felt the blood rush to her face. She immediately snapped back to reality and got rid of her fire. Yup, I feel great. Oh, okay, let's get going. Izuku was a bit taken aback by her quick recovery and continued to become more concerned as she smacked into the stone next to the opening in the wall. Amber recovered quickly as she shook her head, not allowing Izuku nor Paimon to see her blushing face. What was that all about? She didn't even know. Was she getting sick? That must be it. Why would she care what he thinks about her and Lisa? What was up with her? She disregarded these thoughts as she entered the slight opening in the wall and squeezed her way through, the light getting brighter and brighter until she reached the other end. There were stalagmites coming down from the rocky ceiling in the cave. There were multiple openings in the ceiling, which allowed patches of light to enter the cavern. There were strange stone structures which looked as though they hadn't been touched in centuries. This was it. One of the 4 temples. Todoroki's back hit the ground as he let out a gasp for air and quickly got back onto his feet. Both boys had been fighting for quite some time now. Neither one looked good. Both were covered in minor cuts and scratches. Bakugo's index and middle fingers on his right hand had been frozen together. He couldn't make an explosion anymore, mainly due to the fact that he was now so drenched in his own sweat that even the slightest spark could blow him up. Todoroki was now shaking where he stood. Ice nearly took up his whole body. Both boys were now brawling, unable to use their quirks. Bakugo threw himself at Todoroki, and then tried to go for haymaker. Todoroki ducked out of the way at the last second, and slammed his knee into Bakugo's abdomen. The blonde wheezed as he then tried to hit Todoroki with his airborne right leg. But the dual-haired boy ducked and smashed the other boy in the back of the head. Bakugo was sent to the other side of the ring, gasping and swearing under his breath, blood beginning to trickle down onto his face. Todoroki looked over at Bakugo and addressed him once more. I misjudged you. I thought you would be a mere stepping stone to fighting Izuku. You are a W-worthy opponent. He finished, his teeth chattering from the cold. Bakugo gave a crazy grin as he wiped blood from his mouth. You ain't bad either, half and half bastard. You pack a good punch, I'll give you that much. But you're not gonna win this fight. I will be the #1 hero. Everyone will admire me. My quirk is the strongest. He put his hand together and took a deep breath. He then shouted, I won't let you take away my win, my victory, you bastard. Todoroki looked at the boy opposite of him and heard multiple words. Most of them didn't matter to him. But a select few stood out to him. I. Me. My. He really doesn't think about anyone else, does he? Todoroki thought to himself as he stifled an eye roll. It was like hearing a broken record. You'll be a great hero one day, came a new, sudden female voice. Todoroki stopped. Stopped thinking, moving, even breathing for a second. That voice. He gazed around the stadium wildly, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Where was she? She had to be close. Did she manage to come after all? But how? Do you think that I can be even greater than All Might? Asked the young Todoroki. Of course, sweetie, you can do it. You have a great quirk and strength. The woman had responded, cheering him on as he puffed out his chest. Thanks, Mom, I love you. I love you too. Why am I remembering this now? Todoroki thought to himself. Why now? That memory has nothing to do why. Todoroki looked back at Bakugo, who now seemed to be charging up and attack. Todoroki didn't care. All he could think about was what was said to him. I will be the #1 hero. My quirk is the strongest. And then, one final memory entered Todoroki's head. You have a great quirk and strength. You. The one word. The one, single, normal word that made all the difference in the world. She didn't compare him to his father. He looked like his father. He didn't deny that. But they were different people. The thought of creating his own legacy, free of his father's influence. If I give up now, I'll let her down. I can't do that. I can't let that happen. She's probably still rooting for me. Be the hero she wanted me to be. Todoroki chuckled a little as he thought of that last statement. That sounds like something Midoriya would say. Oh well, now or never, I suppose. Bakugo had a demented grin on his face. This was it. He was going to win. He was the strongest in the world, and he was going to prove to everyone how strong he truly was. Howitzer, he began, and then took aim at Todoroki. You still had yet to notice, and launched his attack. Impact. A truly deafening explosion rocked the stadium. There were gasps, cries, and screams as the massive explosion shook the structure. Many of the students were looking around in alarm, in case anyone could try to pull a stunt in all of the current chaos. This is a fight, gasped Class 1B's Itsuka Kendo, who was looking at Bakugo in shock. Is he seriously aiming to kill him? He's crazy. What was Bakugo thinking, launching an attack like that? Yelled Denki Kaminari, who was holding onto his seat for dear life. As the explosion dialed down and the stadium stopped shaking, there was smoke coming from where Todoroki had been standing. Everyone leaned forward in their seat, seeing if the boy was okay. Bakugo was on the verge of unconsciousness, his arms burned and bruised. Considering he had unleashed the attack at full power without his gauntlets. Hell, it was a miracle he didn't blow himself up from the attack due to his sweaty body. There. The blonde-haired boy said to himself as he fought to stay on his feet. That should do it. Should be incapacitated, meaning I won. Told you so, half and ha. And then, from where Todoroki had been standing, emerged a great light. The watchers squinted their eyes against the glaring light, until a wildfire sprang up out of the smoking crater. Everyone was taken aback. Where had it come from? Where was Todoroki? Bakugo looked on in disbelief as Todoroki walked out of the fire, half of his body flaming, while the other side was shooting out icy wind. The signs of fatigue he had showed against Bakugo earlier in their fight seemed to have miraculously vanished. He grinned at Bakugo, unnerving the blonde boy. I want. No. Am to be a hero too, Todoroki said, smiling as his full power was unleashed. He no longer was holding anything back. All of his power, strength, and emotions all pouring out in the form of his quirk. From the stands, where many people sat awestruck at the sudden turnaround, Endeavor stood tall and proud. He raised his eyes and felt something he didn't know he could feel. Pride. Not pride in himself, but in someone else. His son would become the #1 hero, and he would help him along the path there. He raised his head high as he looked at Todoroki approaching Bakugo, which could have easily been interpreted as a predator stalking its prey. He felt his chest swell as he shouted to the heavens. Shoto. Everyone looked surprised at the sudden outburst from the pro hero. Endeavor strode over to the edge of the stands and began to descend the stairs, surprising many bystanders. So, have you finally accepted yourself? That's it. Good. Endeavor shouted at the boy who he knew was listening, although he didn't show it. It all starts from here with you. With my blood, you will surpass me and fulfill my desire. Although no one except Bakugo could see Todoroki's full face, Endeavor could have sworn he saw a tear fall from his son's eye. He wasn't sure though, as the fire and ice grew stronger and prevented the pro hero from seeing his son. Wow, encouragement from Endeavor, unexpected, but it seems to have motivated Todoroki. Will he have what it takes to end the fight? Bakugo looked up at Todoroki. To the dual-haired boy's surprise, there was no fear or shock in his eyes. He wasn't even wearing his usual snarl. He looked on at Todoroki impassively before he raised his right hand, grimacing from the pain when he ignited it in explosions. You may have gotten a boost in power, but that means nothing. He looked on at Todoroki without a sneer or a snarl, as though what he was saying was a fact. I will be the #1 hero, and you don't have a say in it. Todoroki shook his head. Good grief, you love to hear yourself rant, don't you? But don't blame me for what happens next. They both stared each other down, complete unaware of the roaring crowd. This was it. The final attack. Bakugo leaped forward, his fist burning with his quirk. Todoroki could have made an ice wall, but he wanted it to be a final clash. A fight for the strongest man to emerge victorious. Todoroki brought his hands back as he charged them with his quirk, one hand with ice and the other in fire. He then smashed his hands together, mixing the elements, creating what appeared to be a ball of his own quirk. He then grabbed it with his left hand, ignoring the pain that he felt from the fire and ice. He reared his fist back. Bakugo let out a roar as he threw his fist forward at Todoroki. Howitzer nuke. Todoroki threw his fist at Bakugo. As his fist traveled through the air, he thought of everyone who had tried to help him. Fayumi, Natsuo, Mom, Izuku, All Might. Even you in a way, Bakugo, thank you. The two moves collided, and both fighters were engulfed in a huge explosion. At this point, the stands looked as though they were going to fall apart. Pieces of concrete fell out of the walls and from the stands. Mina Ashido melted the rocks away with her quirk acid as Itsuka protected her classmates using her quirk Big Fist. The arena was smoking. No one could make out a person or a movement. The attack had been so big and devastating that the smoke covered the arena for minutes. Finally, the pro hero present mic announced, I see movements down there, so now we find out. Who has won the tournament? The smoke began to clear as a shape was seen standing up, while the other shape was on the ground, outside the ring. The shape that was standing up was swaying, as though they were fighting to stay conscious. The crows looked closer and gasped, recognizing the boy who had fallen. Izuku glanced back at the crack at the wall from where the trio had emerged before continuing after the two girls. The cave was dark, wide, and tall, the only light coming through cracks in the ceiling. Paimon, who had a slight case of encytophobia, grasped onto Izuku's shoulder and didn't let go. The dark nor weird sounds coming from the cavern didn't seem to faze Amber, who kept skipping, her bow on top of her head bouncing as she did so. She was humming under her breath, waltzing across parts of the aged structure without a care in the world, while her hand was alit with her fiery magic. She then pulled out her journal from her backpack and began to note everything she laid eyes on. This is incredible, Amber exclaimed giddily as she dismissed her fire and wrote symbols of ancient text down in her notebook. To think that this is a completely undiscovered temple. The Knights of Favonius are going to be ecstatic when they see this information. Paimon, however, was not having as much fun as Amber. She stayed right on Izuku's shoulder, jumping every time she heard a drip of water coming from a stalagmite. In Paimon's perspective, they were somewhere that could possibly be one of the most dangerous places in the world. When Paimon was younger, she couldn't read at all, since Izuku was willing to be the first one to teach her to some extent. This setback, however, didn't prevent her from hearing others talk about places like this. While she had put on a brave face at first, the facade had crumbled away when they had entered the staircase. Izuku looked a little tensed as well, which made her a bit more nervous. The strangest thing about the situation, however, was that Amber was making her feel the most comfortable. Even though Amber could be Amber, she was also a knight of Favonius, meaning that she knew how to defend herself and others, which made Paimon a little happier. Izuku looked up and around the area. So, what exactly are we looking for again? Amber paused from her writing to gaze around the uninviting cavern, her gold eyes narrowing to try to see into the darker parts of the area. It wasn't specific, although if I were a betting woman, we would probably recognize it. It probably looks different than from the rest of the cave. Izuku nodded as he looked cautiously at the ground in front of him. Amber rolled her eyes from across the room. Come on, I've already ran all the way over here to write this information. You'll be fine. Izuku had taken a step forward while she had said that, and had pressed his foot down on the stone, causing it to sink slightly while making a slight click. Izuku leaped back right when the floor gave away a foot away from him, causing a nearby rock to fall into the abyss. Had he kept walking, he would have died. The green-haired boy looked up at Amber with slightly sarcastic eyes. Amber's eyes were the size of dinner plates, while Paimon, who usually would have started yelling at the outrider at this point, was frozen on Izuku's shoulder, having gone completely pale. Oh, on second thought, maybe come on the exact path I took to get here. Amber squeaked out. Izuku nodded as he carefully jumped from plate to plate, over to where Amber was. It had not been fun trying to remember such insignificant details, especially when he had almost tripped on one of the plates, causing Paimon to faint. Eventually, he had made it over to Amber, where a path lay behind her. Amber then walked over and hit Izuku right on the head. That's for almost screwing up this whole thing. Izuku looked at her confused. Weren't you the one to tell me that I'd be fine? Amber blushed, turning her head while coughing to try and cover it up. I guess I did. Wake her up and let's go. She finished as she relit her hand. Izuku looked down in his arms to see a knocked-out Paimon, who was still completely pale. He put his head to her chest to hear her tiny heart pounding. Well, she's okay. I don't blame her for fainting. I did almost kill us on accident. Amber gave a snort of amusement as she continued to walk ahead, Izuku running to catch up to her as he put the other sleeping girl over his shoulder. It was quiet for a bit as they continued through the cave, the only sound being the dripping of water, the crackle of Amber's fire, and their own footsteps. Izuku then realized that they were completely alone, which was a perfect time to gain more knowledge about the city that they were saving. Sound. Izuku began, catching the archer's attention. Are there any holidays here that I should be aware of? I'm foreign, so I wouldn't know. Amber blinked at him owlishly before she snapped back to reality. Oh, well, there are a few. There's actually one coming up really soon. It's called the Windbloom Festival. It's got games, music, competitions, and the storytelling there is amazing. There's this one guy who comes every year. He's pretty young, but man, are his stories good. Oh cool, Izuku beamed. If that's the case, do you mind if I come with you to it? Amber's grin was frozen on her face as her mind raced with thoughts. Wow, I've never had someone to spend the festival with me. Wait, is he asking me out? No is new. He just needs someone to show him arrow. It's okay if you refuse, Izuku suddenly said, noticing her lack of an answer. I could ask Lisa or maybe Jean to show me around if why. Of course you can come with me, Amber blurted out. I mean, Jean and Lisa are always busy. And I don't want you to make a ruckus or anything of that matter. So I guess I don't have a choice, do I? Of course you do. The green-haired boy responded cheerfully. If you have a lot of work to do, Amber's golden eyes now looked strangely creepy in the dark, the flame on her hand beginning to dim. I said, I guess I don't have a choice, do I? Amber growled at the poor boy. And no, I guess you don't. Izuku responded meekly, turning his head right to avoid making things worse as his head smashed against a stony wall. Hey, are you all right? Amber grabbed Izuku by his shoulders to stop him from falling. Izuku had recovered, but had a busted lip. Don't worry about it. Paimon will fix me up. Izuku told the girl as he wiped his bleeding lip onto his sleeve, turning his gaze towards the giant wall. There was no getting around it, but Amber had noticed his confused gaze. Amber then addressed him. I guess we have to fly up there. We'll use our gliders, okay? Izuku blinked, looking somewhat bewildered. What are you talking about? I never got a glider. Amber looked over at him confusedly. Yes, you did. I gave you one, remember? Right before the storm. Amber's eyes widened as she remembered what had happened right before the storm terror had attacked. Anyway, Amber said, gesturing towards the nearby machine. If you're thinking about becoming a knight, which, may I add, you have almost no chance of becoming, you'll need this. Amber then tried to reach towards the contraption, but it blew away. Oh no. Amber gulped as she looked at Izuku. That contraption I was going to give you was the glider. It blew away because of the attack. Izuku looked on at her impassively for a few seconds before looking back up. How were you going to get up there, Amber? He queried. Amber looked over her shoulder to another crack in the stone. Well, there's moss between those rocks, so I can use that to start a fire, which I can use the wind current produced by the fire to propel myself upwards, although it probably won't be enough. Izuku looked up at the top of the wall before looking back down at his own legs. He knew that Amber could probably get up there if she started a current, but it was too much of a long shot. He knew what he had to do. He muttered a word under his breath that would have had his mom punish him for saying, and looked over at Amber. Do you have any rope or string? He asked her as Amber looked at him weirdly. Well, I have both. Rope because you always need to be prepared, and string in case my bow breaks. Why? Amber asked, giving Izuku a curious look. I have a good idea. He stammered nervously. Amber had heard the stutter, however, and wasn't fooled. She knew whatever idea had popped into his head involved himself getting hurt. Since Paimon was still unconscious, which had been a nice change of pace for the archer, there was no healing at the ready for him. Whatever you're gonna do, Amber began, giving Izuku a serious stare as she reached into her backpack. Be careful. I know you well enough by now to know that your good ideas usually end up with broken bones and torn muscles. Izuku hesitantly nodded, which the outrider knew would have to do. She then pulled out the rope from her back. Whatever you're doing, I'll help out. I'll give you the rope. I need the string for my bow. She then gave Izuku the rope, who grinned at her. Amber, I'm going to need you to hold still, Izuku said as he approached the confused female. Why do you want me to hold still? What are you doing? Amber asked as she took a cautious step back. Izuku groaned internally. He knew that Amber would kill him if he did this, considering he didn't have control over his quirk yet. But he didn't have a choice in the matter. If they wanted to save the village, and possibly find a way for Izuku to get home which he had not told anyone yet, and for the reason being that he would sound insane, then he would have to jump it. Whoa, Izuku exclaimed, looking a little over Amber's shoulder. Miss Jean, what are you doing here? Amber jumped a few feet in the air. Jean, I can explain. I'm sorry we took so long. It's Amber had turned fully around and was staring into the dark cave, without a trace of Jean in sight. Where's Jean? Didn't Izuku say? Amber frowned. Did Helly? Weird. Why would he do that? What would he gain? Amber's eyes widened as she tried to turn around, but found herself unable to do so. The rope she had given Izuku was now tied around her waist, with Izuku next to her, who was now tying the rope around his own. Izuku, what are going to do? Amber positively screamed, ignorant of the blush on her face due to the close contact. She tried to grab the boy, but missed as he finished tying the rope and ducked. Sorry, Amber. It's the only way we're going to get up as of right now. Don't move, okay? The green-haired boy gave her an uneasy smile, which unnerved the girl to no ends. Izuku then moved Paimon to his arms, where he held her bridal style. He inhaled deeply, one for all beginning to charge through his legs. He raised his head. Izuku, don't do it, Amber yelled, as she went to grab her friend to break his concentration. But it was too late. Manhattan leap, the boy roared as he, Amber, and the unconscious Paimon shot into the air. Amber couldn't hear herself scream. They were going so fast. The trio kept shooting up, surpassing the wall's height and continuing to travel upwards. Amber managed to look down as panic overcame her. He had jumped too high. Maybe he would redirect them. Amber looked over to Izuku and grimaced. Izuku was now on the verge of unconsciousness himself, unable to get much air with his legs flapping uselessly in the wind. She then looked over to Paimon, who was still limp in Izuku's arms. Her eyes widened as she realized they were coming to a standstill. They had reached the max height for Izuku's jump, as they began to slowly descend downwards. Amber grit her teeth. They would soon be traveling too fast downward for them to redirect in the air. Amber suddenly gasped as an idea popped onto her head. She quickly summoned her bow in her hand and began to charge her magic into it. Just as she had demonstrated to Izuku, The arrowhead turned a bright shade of red. She bit her lip so harshly that it drew blood as she charged even more energy into the arrow, which caused the head to go from a blood red to a shade of crimson. She then turned around, so that her back was facing the direction she wanted to travel. She looked down. They were picking up speed again. She rotated her head to see how close they were to the top of the wall, which was getting extremely close. She looked around, begging whichever god was listening to help her. And there it was. A stalagmite hanging from across the top of the wall, as if its sole purpose in life was to be there to help her. She took aim, and then yelled to the heavens, "Pyro propel." The arrow was fired, whistling as it traveled through the air as it hit the nearby rock, causing a massive explosion. The force of the explosion launched Amber and the duo onto the top of the wall. Amber hit the ground, landing awkwardly on her shoulder as she snarled from the sudden pain. Izuku hit the ground as well, landing flat on his back with Paimon on his chest, signaling he was alive with a groan. Amber tried to move her shoulder, but to no avail. It was either broken or dislocated, either one being bad. They were so close. All of a sudden, a shrill, childlike scream filled the air. What happened? Amber rotated her head to the side as she saw Paimon, who had snapped out of unconsciousness, and was already healing Izuku, who sighed in relief as his cut lips sealed and legs cracked and fixed themselves. Izuku cracked open an eye and smiled anxiously at Amber, who was glaring at him. "If you ever do anything like that again, I'm letting you fall. Do I make myself clear?" Amber huffed as Paimon was now healing her as Izuku got up and dusted off his legs. "Yes, ma'am. It won't happen again." Izuku lied as he began to walk forward once more, knowing that if they were to explore any other temple like this, he would probably do it again. Amber groaned as she got back on her feet, flexing her shoulder before curtly nodding at Paimon, who stuck her tongue out at the archer in response. Amber dismissed this with a growl, before she and Paimon caught up to Izuku. The trio then walked together for a while, which mostly consisted of Amber yelling at Paimon for fainting, with Paimon's excuse being that the Outrider would have done the same thing had she been in her position. Right before they could go to fists, however, they noticed Izuku staring ahead at something, before he started grinning. "Guys, is that the thing we're looking for?" he asked as he gestured towards the object he had been staring at. Paimon and Amber's eyes landed on what Izuku had been talking about. A glowing, mystical stone stood in the middle of the room, which seemed to be emitting energy. "Dragon's breath," Amber exclaimed, all of her annoyance at Paimon, now nothing more than blimps on her radar, as she ran down a set of stone stairs leading to the stone. "This must be where all of the power is coming from. We did it. Guess we should destroy it now." As Amber pulled out an arrow and summoned her bow, Izuku got closer to the stone. It seemed to be calling to him. As he got closer, he heard voices. He got right next to the rock, unaware of Amber and Paimon calling for him to get away from the rock, due to the arrow Amber was about to launch at it. Izuku stared into the rock. He suddenly heard voices, and familiar voices at that. Voices that made him temporarily stop breathing, his eyes widening. I want. No. Am to be a hero too. I will be the #1 hero. And you don't have a say in it. Fayumi, Natsuo, Mom, Izuku, All Might. Even you in a way Bakugo, thank you. At this, the rock glowed one final time, before shattering to pieces, an arrow piercing through it. Izuku stared blankly as the arrow clattered against the ground as the pieces of the rock began to fade away from existence. Amber and Paimon looked at Izuku with a bit of worry. "Is Izuku all right?" Paimon asked concerned, right as Izuku got up. He then turned towards his new friends and gave them a genuine smile. Amber and Paimon were taken aback as Izuku then turned around and began to walk back from where they came. "Hey, Izuku," Amber called out to him, causing him to pause. "We're going to stay here a while. I need to gather some more information on these texts." Izuku turned around without saying anything and sat down on one of the stairs Amber had ran down. Paimon flew over next to Izuku as Amber wrote in her notebook, with one ear open. "Did you see something?" Paimon asked excitedly. "Did you see something cool?" Izuku looked down at the little girl and nodded while smiling. For the first time in days, he felt hope. That stone had been proof that there could be a way for him to get home. He heard Todoroki and Bakugo. He had heard Todoroki's proclamation and was internally thrilled. He had finally accepted himself for who he was, not who his father was. And Bakugo was still Bakugo. That did raise the question though, who had won the match? Izuku disregarded these thoughts as he quickly spoke to the white-haired girl. "It's a secret, Paimon, sorry." While Paimon huffed and began to cautiously look around the room, Amber frowned. Due to his reaction, It must have been something important to him. Perhaps something of his past. It would explain why he looked so ecstatic. She would eventually have to confront him about this, or else he could never become a trusted member of the Knights of Favonius. Amber shook her head free of these thoughts as she continued to take notes. Izuku propped his head back on the stair behind him, closing his eyes and waiting for Amber to finish. Today had been an eventful day. A very good eventful day.